The Planning Commission meeting of January 24th. Will you all please join me in pledging allegiance to the flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning, Ms. Contreras. Will you give us the TV coverage announcement, please?
Thank you. Planning Commission hearings are televised on County Santa Barbara Television, Channel 20, at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcast of Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV Channel 20. For the roll call, Commissioner Brown.
Here.
Commissioner Boyson.
Here.
Commissioner Smizer.
Here.
Commissioner Valencia.
Here.
Commissioner Cooney.
Here. Good morning, Ms. Black. You have the agenda status report for us.
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair. Members of the Commission, good morning. Item C1 is ready to go. That's the Girls Inc. project, and I believe there's some people in the audience here today to talk to you about that if you have any questions, and the planner will be here as well. The standard agenda item 1, we're recommending, or the flood control district is requesting that we drop that. They've withdrawn their request for the moment. We're going to see if we can work through some of the issues and bring it back to your commission with a consistency recommendation. So we will be doing some additional work on that. And items 2 and 3 are ready to move forward today. And depending on where we are in terms of time, we may want to switch the order of those, but that shouldn't be a big deal, because I think there are more people who may want to speak on the tree issue.
All right.
And that's it.
Then the projection report.
Fairly standard projection report before you today. You can see that you have a hearing. Your next hearing is February 7th, so we won't have a meeting next week because it's a 5th Wednesday. But February 7th is your next meeting in Santa Barbara, and you have about a 4-hour day scheduled so far. February 14th is a North County meeting, and you have about 5.5 hours on that agenda. The 28th is a South County meeting again in February, and that has about 5 hours on it so far. And then we get into March, and we'll see where we're at in a little bit as we move through the month. We will be coming back hopefully next meeting to discuss specific times for the Isla Vista master plan hearing process. So I think we'll know where we're at, because some meetings were supposed to occur at the end of this month, and we thought rather than continue to put things on the projection report and then move them, we would have a little bit more certainty as to where we are. So I anticipate that at your meeting the next meeting, February 7th, we'll have some dates for you to think about. And that's it.
All right. Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is the public comment opportunity for anyone in the public who wishes to address us on matters not on our current agenda. I do have one speaker slip for Bob Field. Mr. Field would come forward. Good morning, Mr. Field.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Belated Happy New Year to you all. I have a request. I'd like to make a point and then make a request. The overall issue here is the Aglands proposals, but more specifically related to some action you took on November 29th and subsequent developments. On November 29th, the Planning Commission voted on 2 motions related to the ag issues. The first was to adopt a recommendation from the ad hoc committee, which had 4 specific recommendations, one of which was to delay moving the expanded home occupation forward until the housing element EIR was complete. The second motion was made by Commissioner Smizer, which was to delay action on the uniform rules until workshops could be held on those issues. I do have some handouts I'll leave here. After that meeting The Santa Maria Times reported the commission voted 4-1 to ask the board to delay action so additional hearings could be held on the uniform rules. The Santa Barbara News Press reported commissioners said the county should hold more public hearings before the Board of Supervisors approves a plan. 5 days later, at the Board of Supervisors, the staff reported to the Board of Supervisors that this commission, and I quote, Planning Commission recommended that all policy initiatives currently underway related to ag be allowed to proceed on their current schedules. Now, you very clearly recommended delay. The newspapers very clearly reported that you recommended delay, and the staff very clearly said proceed. Now, this caused a little stir at the meeting. I spoke with Mr. Ron Cortez, who declined to take the opportunity to correct that. Supervisor Carbajal asked staff what the deal was when a member from the public pointed out the discrepancy, and staff repeated that your recommendation was to proceed. Subsequently, I have quite an email correspondence, I have a record of this for you, with staff, including Shane Stark is being copied in these loops, where staff is either denying that they got it wrong and is currently refusing to correct the public record. Now, I know the Board of Supes can do whatever they want with your recommendation. That's not my point. My point is that I don't think the staff can do whatever they want with your recommendation. And since they are defiant in correcting publicly the public record, I would like to request that you use whatever authority you have to request or direct that the staff accurately report what your action was and publicly correct the public record. I think this is not nitpicking. I think it's disrespectful to the public, to the planning process, to the Planning Commission, and to each of you individually for the staff to defiantly misreport your very clear action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Field. Do we have any other speakers that anyone's aware of that would like to come forward at this time on public comment? Seeing none, we'll move then to Planning Commissioner's informational reports. Commissioner Boyson.
I guess this is as good a time as any. Mr. Chair, this will be my last meeting as Planning Commissioner. Supervisor Centeno has honored me with a request to join his staff full-time, and I've accepted that. I've been on this Planning Commission for 4 years and have certainly enjoyed it. Have served with a lot of good people and have learned a lot. During this time, I've served with, I think it's a total of 10 planning commissioners. While on the Planning Commission, I was honored to serve on the Mission County Formation Commission as well as the Blue Ribbon Budget Task Force, and I think all of these experiences have helped me to get to the position that I'm in now, and can take that knowledge forward in my new challenge, serving specifically the people of the 5th District and the citizens of the County of Santa Barbara. So I want to thank all of you. It's not goodbye. I'll guarantee you that I'll be working with you and be watching everything you do. So. But thank you very much for the experience.
Commissioner Boyson, I might just indicate at the outset that while the news is more welcome than news that you'd be heading to Placer County or someplace else, it's certainly going to be a big change for this commission not to have your wise counsel and perspective on a regular basis. So we may have to work harder to get it, but I hope we'll be able to do that, and we'll look forward to an opportunity soon to pay tribute to your contribution to this commission specifically and the county in general. Commissioner Brown.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate we may be holding a little more formal recognition ceremony, but I just want to say, Jack, for a guy from the North County, you've been okay. Thank you.
You know, and I think that this must have gotten leaked out because I haven't been asked to serve on a subcommittee all month. So I figure staff had to hear this earlier.
Any other information reports, Commissioner Smizer?
Well, I think this is on. Is it on? Yeah. Likewise, I'm not going to let this opportunity go to laud Commissioner Boyson. I know that you've added an awful lot to our commission from perspective of your past life as a contractor, being able to see into some of these projects in a special way. And I think you've been fair and balanced, as well as an advocate for your district as well. So you're everything that a planning commissioner needs to be to represent the county well. And I know that you'll do an excellent job working for Supervisor Centeno. And but we're sorry to see you go.
Thank you very much.
And Commissioner Valencia, last but not least.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to Commissioner Boyson, it's been an honor and a privilege serving with you. I enjoyed all the information that you gave us concerning finances, being an expert in that, and limited golfing experience that you have. So we look forward to seeing you in the future, and good luck.
Commissioner Boyson, your information report doesn't have anything to do about a successor planning commissioner, does it, at this time?
Well, I think there will be an announcement coming out of the 5th District. It's obviously the position has to be noticed, and I know that Supervisor Centeno has looked at candidates, and I'm sure that an announcement will be coming out shortly. And of course, then that has to be approved by the entire Board of Supervisors. But I am confident there will be a planning commissioner sitting in this seat on February 7th.
Great. All right, thank you very much. I would like to add to the discussion this morning the fact that I did meet at the Planning Commission's request with both the director and assistant director regarding ideas for the retreat, which we discussed at our last meeting in general terms. We would like to give you an update on that today and basically get to the point where we would be able to set a date, get the sort of formal arrangements going so we can all get it on our calendars, and then we can flesh out the agenda in the weeks to come. But to begin with, perhaps you could help Mr. Baker and bring us up to date on the thinking that the three of us came to at our meeting.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it doesn't seem to be on.
I think the feedback is such that we can't tell, but
We'll switch.
there we go.
Okay. Yes, we met last week briefly for a meeting with regard to this subject matter, and we kind of came up with, I will call it, just 4 general topic areas that we need to fill in with more detail. But the first one, it was concluded, let me back up and say it was concluded at the last meeting that this would be more of I would call it a process meeting for the Planning Commission, and dealing with process of the way that the commission operates and the likes versus content of specific subjects. So that's the way that we went in terms of our thinking. First item was Planning Commission staff relations, and that's not that they're bad relations, but are there things that we could do to make your decision making and the processes here easier? And that could be staff reports, presentations, the advanced materials coming out of hearing support, any of those kinds of things that would make the operation of the commission work better. I mean, we're always at the point of saying, you know, we're happy with what we got, but I'm always one that says, I know there are things that we can do to help you do it even better. And so that was one item. And that could be a fairly large subject area once we get into it. The second one was just the operation of the commission meetings themselves in terms of times, in terms of appellant, or I will call it, in some cases, appellant and applicant procedures. One of the things that the Board of Supervisors have done, for example, is that the chair has requested that we set up kind of specific times for people that are making presentations so that people kind of get a pretty good idea when they're going to be on the agenda. You know, it isn't always perfect, but the idea of an applicant has so much time and an appellant has so much time, the rebuttal times, and how much time you look at scheduling based on our experience with the general public, how much time we would think it would take. Some people even going to doing specific times on agendas. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily, but I've seen those in the past. So I mean, those are the kinds of things. So are there ways we could make the meetings run more efficiently? And that's different from the way that we give you information to get you ready. Third one is that are there just commissioner relationships in terms of the way that we interact with each other in terms of that, you know, I want to see the light. I mean, for example, in the past, Commissioner Valencia said, you know, make sure that the lights are on, and so that, and our lights are on, and we call people in a kind of an order and stuff like that. There are a number of things that maybe just the internal relationships as we work through the meetings that we could help improve. And then the last item that I put on was because of some suggestions that have been made in the past about commission presentations to the board, bar presentations to the commission, and what should we look at in terms of expectations of doing that or not doing that. There's our pros and cons that I'm sure that we'll get some lively discussion. Those are the 4 areas that we talked about so far, and we'd like to start putting more meat to the bones if those are areas that people agree on. We also talked about doing it on a Friday afternoon, mid-county, Buellton, Solvang, somewhere in that area, in a place that we can get it. Start with a lunch, and then, and this would be, of course, noticed and public able to come to that meeting whenever we schedule it.
Anything to add, Ms. Black? That I would like to mention just the last aspect. Our thinking was that in an afternoon we could accomplish a good deal of the sort of internal workings of the commission. How can we do a better job of going through our agendas to accommodate the public, to accommodate staff when they have presentations, being as predictable as we can, just looking for ways to improve, more tinkering rather than wholesale revision to any of our policies. We were mindful of the fact that if we're going to aim in the direction of having the commission at an off-site meeting, while the public would be more than welcome to attend, we would steer away from issues which, from our review of projects, would be of concern to the broader public. It would be of more interest to the commissioners, just the people up here doing the job. To that end, we would notice the meeting to start early in the afternoon, and the commissioners would be invited to attend a luncheon beforehand at which no business would be discussed. So it would be just among the commissioners, and the opportunity for just social interchange, which I think we have too little time to do. That's the thinking so far. I welcome your comments and input, as well as whether the suggestion of a mid-county meeting, did you say late in March, or are you aiming for any particular time?
Actually, we would suggest March 23rd.
Okay.
Friday, March 23rd.
The
I think that was somewhat agreed upon the last time we talked, of doing it on a Friday was okay with everybody, except for Commissioner Brown, who was not here at that meeting.
Those are broad outlines. The topics by no means are intending to exclude other things that we can add of the same type. You know, I certainly value the participation at our meetings of our regular contributors, such as Mr. Allen, Are we interacting with county council's office in a way that's satisfactory to the commissioners? Might be another topic that we could discuss. But there really is going to be a lot more to talk about than we'll have time for. And the idea is, I think that at another workshop in a general nature, we'll tackle some of the problems that we can't address necessarily on a topic by topic basis within the concept of projects, but that are very important for us to discuss. I'm not sure where the issue raised by Mr. Field this morning fits, but it might well be within the context of a broader public discussion of our relationship to the Board of Supervisors, to the BARs, to other agencies of the county, and how we can most efficiently fill our role. Commissioners, input on these ideas so far? Commissioner Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think these are great topics. I would like to see that perhaps some of the content issues that you discussed, and maybe some of the commissioners put forth, I know I put forth a list, would be helpful and useful for this commission at some point in time. I'm not necessarily saying for this retreat, and I'm sure that there will be issues coming out of the retreat too that the commissioners will probably want to follow up on. But I think that it's fine. I think it's going to be a busy afternoon. There will be a lot of spirited discussion, and we probably will find that there's enough for another retreat at some time later in the year. Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I will continue to work with Mr. Baker and Ms. Black to get something in writing for you, hopefully by our next meeting, so that we have a more crystallized starting point, and then the rest can add whatever topics. And then, of course, if we have a new commissioner as early as February 7th, we'll be looking for input from him or her as well. And it will be a good opportunity for the new commissioner to get used to the rest of us in an informal setting. So I think there are several purposes for the retreat, and it's a good way to start our year, perhaps on a regular basis, not just occasionally. Anything else from anybody on this topic? That ends our informational reports, and we'll move then to divisional briefings. Do we have any today?
No, Mr. Chair, that we don't have any divisional briefings.
Good thing, because I didn't know of any, and I don't like
No
those surprises.
surprises.
That's right. So we have the minutes of our 2 earlier January meetings, and at the outset, I want to compliment our hearing support staff. They are making a concerted effort, which I know we all encourage, to get us back the draft minutes within the same month as our meetings occur. So on a typical basis, at our 3rd meeting of the month, we should see the meetings of the first 2 monthly meetings, and they should be relatively recent in our minds, so at least we remember generally what we talked about. We have before us today first the hearing held January 3rd, 2007. Are there any comments, corrections, additions? I did have, Commissioner Smyser, did you have some? Okay, I did want to mention on page 4, there appear to be 2 identical typos in the paragraph 1 and 2 at the top of the page with respect to the roadway of the Pulver lot split discussion. The last line of each paragraph says the no stopping signs, fire lane signs will be and it looks like 150, but I think it's 15 feet. I'm not sure what the correct number is there, but I recall it being closer than 150 feet. Anybody remember specifically?
Mr. Chair, we'll find out and we'll make sure the right number is in there.
Okay. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes of January 3? as
Mr.
amended?
Chair, I'll so move the approval of the minutes of January 3rd with whatever revision is made concerning the question concerning distance.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Ms. Contreras, will you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
The next set of minutes are for our hearing of January 10, 2007. Any comments or corrections from commissioners? Other than the chair?
Move for approval, Mr. Chair.
We have a motion to approve. Is there a second? And we can
Mr. Chair.
discuss it.
Did have a question about this particular item. I didn't see, and maybe I just missed it, I didn't see in there that I had recused myself.
Well, I had a question about that too, Commissioner Smizer. The action reported is that it passed by a vote of 301, and it mentions that you are recused. Now, I think recusal is a sufficiently important event in the course of considering action that we probably ought to have a line as to the fact that a commissioner recused him or herself and the basis for that. I think looking back at our minutes, just the word recusal doesn't enlighten the reader as to the basis for that. And Commissioner Smizer, perhaps you could just recall exactly the basis for your recusal at that time so we can add that into the minutes. It had to do with a mediation, I believe, that you were conducting that involved this project.
I was a court-appointed settlement officer on a case that involved the applicant.
Okay. And then the vote, I don't think should reflect an abstention. A recusal indicates that the commissioner is not involved in the vote or the hearing. So it really, I think, subject to Mr. Allen's input, should really be 3-0 in this case because Commissioner Smizer was not a part of the hearing and Commissioner Brown was absent.
Mr. Chair, the one is actually to reflect Commissioner Brown's absence. 301. So
if a commissioner's absent, you reflect them as
Yes.
abstaining?
no, well, I think that's how we typically show it, isn't it?
But then on C1, you have 4 zeros.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Ms. Mendoza indicates that the one is a recusal, so if you want to treat it as an absence, it'd just be 3-0.
Mr. Allen, do you have a feeling one way or the other?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, we may discuss this a little bit further, but my opinion is that when a commissioner excuses himself because of a conflict or something of that nature, it should just show an absence for that item.
So the vote
In other
should be
words, I agree with the
reflected
chair.
as 3-0.
Correct.
Okay. So if we could make those corrections, Commissioner Valencia has made a motion to correct, to approve. Commissioner Valencia, are you satisfied with the proposed changes?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to have to think that over. Yes, that's fine.
Do we have a second?
I'll
Second.
second.
Simultaneous second by, all right. Commissioner Boyson, we're going to get your name in here as much as we can today. So the second is Commissioner Boyson's. Ms. Contreras, the roll call, please.
Commissioner Brown?
Abstain.
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Vote carries 4-0-1.
Exactly. The director's report of the Board of Supervisors and anything else that you have for us, Mr. Baker.
Well, my first item was going to congratulate you on the appointments that were made by the Board of Supervisors 2 weeks ago. One of them was Mr. Boyson. And I hope this doesn't create the kind of concern that has been raised by citizens of another part of this county that we've been listening to for the last couple of weeks. And actually, I'm just saying that tongue-in-cheek. I don't think that that will happen. But I think we would just pass along, it's been a short time for me, but I know that Diana and the rest of the staff have really appreciated your participation and willingness to sit on ad hoc committees when requested and such. So, it's going to be a loss for the commission. So we're sorry to see that. The other last item that I would point out, your item number 1 that you mentioned in the minutes, the Pulver lot split, has been appealed to the Board of Supervisors. So you're going to get to hear a little more about that one before it's all over. Other than that, that's all I have for today.
Mr. Baker, do you know which group or individual filed the appeal? Ms. Black knows? Yes.
It was the Gray family.
The Gray
Mr.
family.
Chair, that filed. The people at the very end of the road, and we are actually reviewing that appeal, given our new procedures. So we'll let you know.
Please
that
keep us
goes.
posted on that. Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that I spoke to the planner this morning, and it's the same issue that they brought forth. It's concerning the Gray family feeling, or Miss Gray feeling that they have this 40-foot easement, which our counsel here said that he found no evidence of. So that's something that'll have to be worked out. So that's what she was appealing about.
Thank you. Ms. Black?
Mr. Chair, I just remembered that the board took another action, I think last week in Santa Maria, on an item that you had requested be referred back to.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members of the board commission, I will follow up. The North Point is going to be referred back to the Planning Commission at the Planning Commission's request. So that one will be coming back. You recall this is the one that with the HOA dispute and the conditions that were put out there, and then the applicant for the project appealed them. And so the board agreed and is sending it back to you.
Very good. That's it, Mr. Baker. Thank you very much. We would normally move to our consent agenda, but I anticipate this taking a little longer to go through than the usual consent agenda. So I'm going to call for a 5-minute recess and let staff set up for this, and we'll take up the Girls Inc. matter following that. On our agenda is item C1, which I would ask you, Ms. Contreras, to read into the record.
Thank you. The following is the hearing on the request of Jim Zimmerman, agent for Girls Inc., to consider case number 06RVP17, application filed on April 20th, 2006, and to approve the addendum to negative declaration 00ND42 pursuant to the state guidelines for the implementation of CEQA.
Do we have any ex parte communications or site visits to report, Commissioners? Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Last Thursday, I had an extensive site visit with the applicant, and we had a great tour of the facility and a chance to ask lots of questions since I wasn't involved with the original project, and got brought up to speed on that, and opportunity to address some of my other concerns about what they were proposing. So yes, I did. Thank you.
Commissioner Valencia?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I visited the site.
And Commissioner Smizer?
I also visited the site.
Commissioner Boyson? Okay. Commissioner Boyson moved on. I'm going to keep jabbing him here so he stays with us one more time. This is a site with which I'm quite familiar, but I did drive by to refresh my recollection of the construction project. So with that, this is on the consent agenda. I'm a little concerned about that. This has attracted so far 5 speaker slips, and Commissioner Brown, what's your feeling about it being a consent matter as opposed to
Well,
regular agenda?
Mr. Chair, I was going to make a request that we do pull it off the consent agenda since we do have speakers, quite a few speakers here. And I think that would be helpful to facilitate the understanding of the project.
Any objections from any other commissioners? All right, then I would ask staff, Mr. Tuttle in particular, if you would just give us a brief overview of the project.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. So many of you are familiar with the project when it first was approved 6 years ago to this very day, actually. The project was approved at that time primarily to serve the Girls Inc. programs and activities. With that approval, however, there were certain allowances for use of the facility by other outside groups. Namely, they were permitted to have once per week use of their facilities by community groups for meetings, and twice per year four times per year use of the facility for special events. In addition, outside play areas, the soccer field, those areas could be used by the public when not in use by the Girls Inc. programs. Since that time, Girls Inc. has discovered that there is large interest by the general community to use the facilities when they're not being used by the Girls Inc. programs. And to facilitate that, they've come in to request that the facility be opened up a bit more to the general public. Specifically, what they're requesting, and I'll just run through the list of the proposed changes to the use of the facility, are that special events would be increased from 4 per year to an allowance of 2 times per month. The limitations on use would be between 6:30 and 9 p.m. during the week, and any time concluding by 10 p.m. on weekends. The limit to the special events would be limited to the number of people that could be accommodated by parking on site, as well as currently overflow parking at Hollister School is permitted by the school district. So currently that total is 95 spaces, which would equate to a maximum event of about 200 people. In addition to that, they're proposing to expand the use of their facilities for small community group meetings. Between 25 and 40 people at those meetings is what they expect, and those would be unlimited. Right now, again, they're limited to once per week, but it would be fairly open. Time limits for that would be between 6:30 and 9 p.m. during the weekdays only. Again, all these activities are only when the facility is not being used by Girls Inc. programs. In addition to those meetings, they are proposing to allow use of their gymnasium by other outside athletic groups, namely the Page Center programs, as well as the volleyball club, Santa Barbara Volleyball Club. Those would occur during weekdays between 6:30 and 9 p.m. It's anticipated that it would be up to 2 teams practicing at a time, which would equate to about 24 youth and coaches at any particular time. Then there's just a couple other minor changes that they're requesting. Currently, amplified sound is limited to a PA system for emergency purposes. They're requesting that amplified sound be allowed for some of their indoor activities. We have requested or proposed conditions that would make sure that if amplified sound is being used, the doors and windows opening outside to the surrounding residential neighborhoods would be kept closed to address any potential noise issues associated with that. Also, the facility was built initially, or is being built initially for noise attenuation. So all the methods and materials used in the construction would naturally attenuate sound going outside. And then the last minor change is to extend the operating hours. Currently, the operating hours are from 7:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. Throughout the entire week, and they're proposing to allow that to extend to 10 p.m. on weekends. And primarily, again, that would just be for the occasional special event. They do have, there was a little confusion when the project was originally approved. In the project description, it did talk about this open area between Hollister Avenue and the facility, that it would be used for community garden or passive public open recreational space. The plans, however, were approved with it just being landscaped, and those were the plans that were approved. So just a minor clarification to the project that it would that frontage area would just be landscaped as approved in the plans. That is it for what they're proposing, and certainly be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Commissioner Brown.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Tuttle, would you just clarify the information that you gave concerning the outdoor field, because it's really part of the detention basin. It's not really a soccer field, but just provide some further explanation on that.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Brown. The soccer field in the rear of the property is not a full-size regulation soccer field. It was constructed for a dual use as both a play area. Primarily, it would just be used for practices. For Girls Inc. activities, and then the other purpose is for detention for drainage purposes, and that was a solution that was developed in consultation with flood control back when the project was originally approved. So it's not the type of field that would bring in weekend tournaments or anything like that. Regular games, it would just be solely used for practices, and there's really no change in use proposed as part of that element of the project.
Any other questions from commissioners of staff at this point? I had one for Mr. Allen. This is a bit unusual. We are reviewing a project that was approved for a conditional use years ago, within a few years. And as I understand, the level of environmental review at that time was a negative declaration mitigated for environmental impacts. And it appears staff has addressed the potential additional impacts by suggesting some additional conditions and raising the issues in the staff report. Is that sufficient environmental review for the commission to take action on the proposed modification? I think that's my question.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, there is an addendum that has been prepared for this project, which is is appropriate when the changes do not create new significant impacts as mitigated.
Where is that? I guess my problem was I hadn't seen an addendum to the environmental document. It's attached as a separate exhibit.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, it's included as attachment B to the staff report. It's in the form of a letter, which is the standard format for a 15164 CEQA addendum.
The January 5th, 2007 letter?
That's correct.
Okay. So you're satisfied this is the appropriate manner of review of the original environmental document?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, yes.
Commissioner Valencia?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I visited the site, and I saw this map that we have here, which is a planting plan. I'm sure it doesn't plan to show the parking, but there's much more parking that I saw there at the site than this plan here shows, so it's not quite accurate for parking.
Anything further, Mr. Tuttle, at this point?
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, only if you have any questions, but I have nothing further to offer at this point.
Appears you've answered what we need for now, and so we have, we're now up to 9 speakers on this matter. I would encourage the speakers to abbreviate their comments if it's simply to indicate support or opposition or agreement with prior speakers, but With that admonition, everyone will be entitled to as much as 3 minutes, and we'll keep track and look forward to your input. The first of our speakers is David Burke, and he'll be followed by Bob Yost. So if Mr. Yost could be ready to approach the podium, that would be great. I'm the architect. I just want to say a few words. Okay, fine.
Mr. Chair, Chairman, where? Oh, all right. I'm the architect for Girls Inc.
And your name, sir?
Pardon?
Your name for the
James Zimmerman.
Okay.
And when we initiated the project in 2001, the buildings, the circulation was designed with the sensitivity of the neighbors. We limited heights so that the views would not be inhibited, and the gymnasium was angled toward the back, adjacent to Hollister School, so that any noise projecting out from there would not affect the neighbors. A courtyard in the center of the project would be for girls playing, having lunches, which is being held now adjacent to San Marcos Gardens. That's all going to be moved within the courtyard itself. The gymnasium is fully insulated, thermopane doors, windows to limit noise. And if you have any other questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
I don't think we do at this point.
And everyone seems happy with the design. We've gotten many, many comments on how it blends with the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else from Girls Inc. that wanted to address the proposal before we turn to the public? We have, they're included in the speakers. Okay, we'll just take them in the order presented then. Mr. Burke, I presume?
Yes, my name's Dave Burke. I'm live at San Marcos Court. As a matter of fact, I look right out my back window right into their front door. And I'm representing the 13 homeowners at San Marcos Court. And our biggest issue is, of course, the sound. And the thing that we're concerned about is that if the hours are extended till 10 o'clock at night, it may be a nice soundproof building and all that, but at 10 o'clock, where do all those people go? They come out into the parking lot, they're talking, they're fooling around, they're doing whatever they do, so the noise goes on till 10:30 or 11. The other thing we've found over a period of time, just with the experience of them being there so far, is they're not really good at controlling the sound and controlling the events around the building. And so I can see the conditions of approval, and they're really great. They say that the sound will stay inside or they'll go somewhere else. But if 10 o'clock is a cutoff date, then we're going to be in trouble till 10:30 or 11. So, and the other thing is, if there is a group there other than a Girls Inc. group, who do we call besides the sheriff if there's a problem? We don't want to be bad neighbors and have to call the sheriff every time there's a big party or a big going on in the parking lot. And at this point, there's really nobody to call, even when they're there right now. So I would like to see some sort of condition that if there's a outside group, that they be required to hire a security guard or somebody to enforce a curfew. And I'd like to see it terminate at 9:30 so that by 10 o'clock it's lights out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Mr. Yost. And the next speaker will be Mary Howe Grant.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, my name is Bob Yost. I'm the Executive Director of the Page Youth Center. To answer just a couple questions as noise and that, we've primarily talked to Girls Inc. about using the facility for practice facilities. There's a tremendous amount of need within the sports community for places for our children to go and to be able to play and to practice. My own programs that I have internally, I serve about 3,000 children during the year. From December through June, I'm booked. I have people coming wanting to rent space, wanting to actually do new programs or start programs that I have to turn away. So there's more youth in the community than we can all service. My need is for practice facilities, which means I bring children in there with a coach to practice for 2 to 4 hours, primarily on the basketball side. Noise from that I can attest to you from my facility, which is about 16,000 square feet. Once you're in a practice mode and you're outside, it's relatively quiet. Even during the summertime, I can't address the fact of the event type thing, but from the sports programs, it's a very reasonably quiet. Most of my parents are drop-off pickup, so they're not standing around the parking lot creating that kind of a noise atmosphere or anything else. The kids are in there, they've practiced, they're ready to go home. So that's mine. I'd be happy to answer any questions or do anything, but I'm in favor of the project. There is, as I say, a critical need for gymnasium space and for places for the kids to go within our community. Thank you.
Mr. Yost, does the Page Youth Center have any cutoff time at night for its events?
I cut off about 11 o'clock. I have neighbors that, being in the on Hollister Avenue, I sit down in a gully, so my noise will carry up and across the street. There have been occasions where if you have depending on a type of party, I limit my parties to nonprofits. I don't do any outside type organizations that come in because sometimes they get a little out of control, but very seldom. I haven't had a complaint in 3 years that I've been there with any of the parties that we've had in from the neighbors. So most of the professional organizations that come in, rather than you get some family organizations that come in that are noisy, but most of the professional and the nonprofit things that I think Girls Inc. are talking about are relatively quiet. They're fundraisers. They're designed to get in and help community organizations do it. I also provide meeting spaces similar to what Girls Inc. is proposing. Again, I have no problem with those. People are coming to board meetings and group meetings that they need to have. And again, there's a need in our community. I turn people away because I don't have enough space to provide meeting rooms for some of the nonprofits in town. But
Thank
I have, I have about a 23,000 square foot facility that's just primarily 16,000 square foot of gym floor. So can get a little ambitious at times, but they come and go, and it's fairly quiet from the sports side of it. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Mary Howe Grant, and next will be Sheila Zimmerman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Mary Howe Grant. I'm a member of the Girls Incorporated Board of Directors, Girls Incorporated of Greater Santa Barbara. I'm currently the new building chair of that committee, and I'm immediate past president of the organization. We are very proud of our new Girls Inc. Center, and we've realized that as we've been building this, the potential of it being a real community asset. And that is one of the reasons that we want to provide the community access to our facilities. You've already heard about Page Youth Center wanting to use our gymnasium. We will have a regulation-sized basketball court. You will hear from the Santa Barbara Volleyball Club about their desire for practice space, and you will not hear today about any community groups who want to use our theater, but I will tell you that once it is known that we have a theater, a wonderful stage, and about 150 seats possible, there will be community groups that will come up and want to use our theater as well. I would like to, and also our meeting rooms. I'll put on my another hat for a moment and tell you that I'm also a member of the board of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UCSB, and as a member of Ollie's board, I will tell you that it is very difficult to find meeting rooms for classes that we wish to offer in the community, especially meeting rooms that have parking. Our classes are only usually 10 or less in the class, but this would be a facility in which Ollie would be very interested in using some of those meeting rooms. I would like to address very, very briefly Mr. Valencia's comment about there being additional parking from what is shown on the drawing. I disagree, sir. Only the parking that is shown on that drawing will be there. What you are seeing now, I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, but I believe what you're seeing now is the open space where there will be landscaping. But the area that is paved at this time is the limit of the parking spaces that will be on that site, and they are all shown on that drawing. Okay. I would also like to address the second before speaker's comment about noise in our facility. And I will admit that it has been a problem in the sense that we have a temporary site there now. And we are using the two buildings that are on the, I guess we would say, the southwest corner of our property. And the only area we have that is outdoors for our girls that is shaded is along the fence of the San Marcos Court neighbors. Once our new building is opened, the girls will no longer be congregating there. I would also like to say that when I was president of the board, when I received complaints, I went out to the site. And there is noise at particular times of day. It is not constant during the day. And if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them at this time.
Mr. Chair?
Yes,
A question.
Commissioner Brown.
Yes.
The proposal to have other groups into the building, will there be a Girls Inc. employee there during the evening hours if there are no Girls Inc. activities and there are other groups in there?
At this point in time, we had not put that as a requirement, depending upon the group. If we had people we didn't know, the answer would be yes.
So how would your proposal be to ensure that the facility is properly closed if there is
Right.
no question?
We presume that if we indeed contract with the Page Youth Center or the Santa Barbara Volleyball Club, that they will be very careful about closing up this facility because they will want to continue their relationship with us. And if they're not careful about it, then they would not be able to continue this relationship. So what we're proposing basically is ongoing relationships, shall I say. I think that if some group that we don't know anything about is requesting to use our facility, then we would make sure that someone from Girls Inc. were there. We do not at this time, we have not gotten to the point of drawing up contracts for people of this nature. But if we have ongoing usage, obviously we would not feel it were necessary for a Girls Inc. person to be there. We would feel that the other organization would have to be responsible. Do you see what I'm saying?
Thank you very much, Ms. Halgrant. Sheila Zimmerman. Jim Villanueva is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commission. My name is Sheila Zimmerman, and I'm the current president of the board of Girls Inc. And I would like to say that with Mary, we are very proud of our building. We are very proud of the fact that we have worked with the county and the community, the neighbors. With them in mind, we have designed a building that we think will be enable us to be good neighbors. In addition to all the other things that have been put into the building, our landscaping plan is quite extensive, and we have 100 trees in that plan, which will effectively screen most of the area. And as well as, if you look at the plan closely, as well as many exotic and beautiful plants, it will be a community showplace, I believe, when it is finished. Girls Inc. Operates a facility in downtown Santa Barbara, as you know, which we will continue to operate. And we have always worked with neighbors and have not had any complaints downtown. We also have a gymnasium there, and we limit the noise as much as possible. The noise of children playing is something that, can't totally eradicate. But I happen to live personally share a fence with La Patera School on the main playground, and there are hundreds of children there playing all day long, and I've lived there for 35 years, and I don't even hear them anymore. And occasionally when I do go outside and am working in my garden, the noise is a happy noise of children playing. So I don't, I don't object to it personally, and I do know what some of the neighbors are hearing. The neighbors that are complaining about noise, with our temporary space that we have there now, the children eat snack and lunch right out by their backyard. that will be completely eliminated. They will be well away from there in the courtyard, in the center of the building. So it's like an atrium surrounded by building. I doubt if they will ever hear them. They may hear them when they're on the playground for short times, for short periods. But Girls Inc. does most of our activities indoors. We have programs for them, computer programs, all sorts of instructional programs. They have theater, dance, and they're very busy with science, art, other projects, all done inside. We did not intend to have the community in our building. We have just been overwhelmed by the demand for people who are asking us in the community and telling us there is no space, there is no place like this anywhere in the community in that area. And because of the large demand from the community, we have decided that it would be, good for us, good for the community to offer our space and try to accommodate these youth activities. We would not be letting anyone who was not nonprofit use the building. And it has been my experience that most nonprofits are very responsible people. So that's all I have to say. Any
Thank
questions?
you very much. Don't see any right now. Thank you very much. Mr. Villanueva. Next will be Pat Levy.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, thank you.
Good morning.
My name is Jim Villanueva, and I serve on the board of the Santa Barbara Volleyball Club. We are a nonprofit organization and serve a couple hundred girls from grades 3 through 12 in our volleyball programs. I'm here to support this request for a revision to allow community groups like ours access to the Girls Inc. facility. I can tell you that there is a crisis, a critical shortage of facilities for community use in Santa Barbara for indoor sports. We've been in existence since the late 80s. In recent years, and we've been housed primarily at Mr. Yost's facility, the Page Youth Center. In recent years, we've been cut dramatically back in our access to the Page Youth Center because of the growing demand for youth services. This leaves us in a position, since we don't own a facility ourselves, to have to scour Santa Barbara, Goleta, Carpinteria for available space to carry out our programs serving the girls that we serve. We have engaged real estate brokers. We've talked to high schools, colleges, city parks and recreation. One of our board members serves on that board as well. We talked to the airport authority. We've scoured from Carp to Goleta and have been unable to find facilities to provide our services. We're in danger of really dramatically reducing or even going away if we can't find community space to serve the girls that we serve. And this Girls Inc. facility is ideal for that purpose. And particularly since our mission is to serve girls of the same ages that they're serving, it's a perfect situation for us, and so we very much support it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Villanueva.
Mr. Chair, I just have a question. The Girls Inc. has proposed that there would not be any employee there of Girls Inc., but it would just be, since you would have a long-term contract with the organization, that you would be the responsible party for ensuring the orderliness of people coming and going and so on and so forth. But my question to you is, if there is a problem, there would be no... How would neighbors communicate with you? They don't have a phone. They'd have to physically come over to the facility. There'd be no way to get in touch with you, since there's not, you're you're not really part of the organization, you're a different organization. So my concern would be there's sort of no continuity, that you're just using the facility, but and I realize that you would be mindful of neighbors and the youngsters who use your facility aren't going to be out of order or out of control. I understand that. But there may be some instance where you never know, and I'm just wondering how you would envision your being sort of the point of contact when you're not in a telephone range or there's not a stationary phone number where they could call you.
Yeah. Our administrative director, Casey Collins, is in line to speak, and she can speak to her experience having been involved with the Carpinteria Girls Volleyball Club and the Carpinteria Girls Inc. and how that works. Our club, like I said, doesn't own a facility, and so we're in this position of having to have coaches on site at all times and keeping the orderliness. We're bound by our agreements with the Page Youth Center, and in another case, we use a gym at UCSB on occasion, and so we have to abide by their rules and so forth. So I'm not exactly sure how to address that, other than we would have coaches on site at all times. These kids aren't unsupervised.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pat Levy and Barbara Levy is next.
My name is Pat LeVay, and I am on the board of Girls Inc. I don't have a lot to add. I just want to stress that this facility is in fact a community asset, and that we need to find some way, a way of sharing it with the community, particularly the theater, the gym, and the meeting rooms. I'd like to clarify one thing, that as far as increasing our operating hours, previously we are already approved from 7:30 to 9 every week. What we're only asking for is that it go from 7:30 to 10 on weekends. Do you have any questions?
I do.
Commissioner Smizer has a question, Ms. LeVay.
Yes.
Ms. LeVay, you may not be the person to ask this, but since you're a member of the board, perhaps you are. Earlier question was regarding complaints, and I'm thoughtful that if someone was to complain that evening, there probably wouldn't be a response unless it was a criminal complaint.
Yes.
And then of course they would call the sheriff. But wouldn't it be that if someone in the community thought that a particular group was noisy or kept them up some night, that they would call, that community member would likely call Girls Inc. with the occasion of when it occurred, what occurred, and describe it to you, and then I would guess that your board would take an action on with that particular nonprofit that was using the facility and correct it for the future. That would be my guess.
Yes, we would take all complaints very seriously, and would try to resolve them to the satisfaction of the complainer and Girls Inc.
Okay.
I would assume that if there was a complaint in the middle of the evening on a particular event, that there's no reason why the Girls Inc. Number could not be called and have the complaint registered as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. LeVay. Barbara Levy is next, and Liz Town Gilbert is to follow her.
Good morning. Like Pat LeVay, I'm mainly here to reiterate my support for the use of the facility for the community. I think it's a really wonderful asset. I've just been impressed by that as I've seen the building grow. I'm mindful of the concern of the neighbors, and I appreciate their concerns, but I also know the board of Girls Inc., and I've got to say I am on the board of Girls Inc. And I'm fairly optimistic that we could work out any concerns to our mutual satisfaction. I would hope that would be true. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Town Gilbert. Casey Collins is the last speaker.
I just want to, my name is Liz Town Gilbert, and I'm the director of the volleyball club. And we have over 275 girls currently that has been obviously crazy and a crisis. So I'm definitely in support and just an opportunity. I mean, we're here to empower young girls, and we think that we fit really nice with the Girls Incorporated. And just an opportunity. One of the things I must admit is that we do have to use UCSB. We do have to use the Page Youth Center. And over 20 years, we have not been kicked out of a facility due to noise or complaints. So hopefully we have our girls in line to act accordingly.
Thank you. Thanks for coming down. Casey Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am the Administrative Director for Santa Barbara Volleyball Club. I have my logo on because I am 24/7 Volleyball Club. I want to address a couple issues that I've heard, and that is we are in total support of this, obviously, because we would like the opportunity to use a gym. I've been with the volleyball club as a nonprofit for almost 9 years. We started about 12 years ago as a nonprofit. And in that time, when I drive by an empty gym, my heart breaks because I have many, many, many children, girls, who would be using that gym if we could find the gym time. This has been an issue for many years, and we've had a lot of people step forward and help us out, but there are more children, and there are more children playing sports, and that's what we want to see. So if we can help to promote this gym time as a nonprofit dealing with girls, we feel we're a great fit with Girls Inc. And I also have a selfish thing. I was the athletic director for the Girls Inc. of Carpinteria. I ran a volleyball club in that gym. I also rented the facility to outside programs as well, and I kept the gym full of kids. There was never a problem with someone on site if there was a noise issue or a problem or if someone needed to lodge a complaint. If they didn't have our landline, they could always call me on a cell line, and I'll be happy to give anyone that cell line. We had a liaison that would stay after hours with those programs if we could not have a Girls Inc. employee, but we always had someone that everybody in the community started to know because that person would stay and watch that facility. Again, as that athletic director, having many, many teams coming into that gym, very little complaints. A parking issue, parents drop people off, not even an issue. They pick up their kids at the end. And this is for all sports. It was for basketball. I had roller hockey, many different things going on. And it was a great thing to be able to have outside programs come in and be able to rent that facility because we had more kids being served. And that's what ultimately I think that we like to see as a Girls Inc. mission. I think that that was something we enjoyed having because we were able to serve more girls that weren't necessarily part of our programs. And I just think this would be a great opportunity to open up something for young kids. And as the Bleeding Heart, our kids of today are going to be maybe the Planning Commission of tomorrow, and I'd like to find them a place to play volleyball. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Collins. Thanks to all of the speakers for giving us their perspective. I'd like to bring the application back to staff for any follow-up comments with regard to testimony they've heard either from the applicant or the members of the public. Mr. Tuttle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Just going through my notes from the public speakers and from the applicant, and there's nothing that was said that staff feels the need to respond to or to discuss. So, again, I'm here to answer any questions you might have or go over any concerns you might have. Thank you.
Any questions from commissioners of staff at this point? Commissioner Valencia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I mentioned the parking, and I still have a question with it. I count about when I look at the plan, I count about 60, 65 spaces, and they mentioned that they have 95 parking spaces, so seems to be a little difference there. And second, I have a question concerning the, when I was trying to find the site, I called the Girls Club of Santa Barbara, that number 963-4757, and it just like, just went through a list of, if you want to talk to so-and-so, 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 and it was hard to get somebody to talk to. There are just a lot of numbers to call. And like the neighbor that lives by there, he says if there's a problem, they need a number to call. So I'm not opposed to the girls' club use facility, and but the 95 spaces, I wonder were they counting on-site spaces plus off-site spaces? They need to clarify that.
Can we straighten that out, Mr. Tuttle?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Valencia. That's exactly what the 95 includes. It includes the identified or designated 54 spaces that are on the project site. Plus, at this point in time, Hollister School has identified 41 spaces that the Girls Inc. Could use during their some of these overflow activities where the additional parking is required. And they provided a letter to that indicating that, and that as long as it wasn't being, those parking spaces weren't being used by Hollister School functions, that Girls Inc. would be able to use them. And it makes great circulation sense because Hollister School is immediately south of the Girls Inc. property, and people can walk right through the fields, and there's a gate that you can enter. So there's no worry about a lot of people walking through neighborhoods or anything like that to get from one space to the other.
All right, thank you. That clears that. And the phone number, I think they need a phone number on weekends to call, or somebody to call if there's a problem. And when I called, it seemed to go through a menu of if you want to speak to so-and-so, call so-and-so. If you want to speak to so-and-so, call so-and-so. But there wasn't a person to speak to. And I understand that because they're probably off duty at that time. But if I was having a hard time finding the site. Believe it or not, I drove into a neighborhood trying to find the area, and finally, when I went down south, I did find the site. I think they do need a phone number to call in case of a problem. I don't have any problem with the parking now. The parking is clear. So I think it's a great facility, and I'm in support of the propositions that they have. I don't have any problems with it. I think they just need a phone number to make available to the people of the community, especially the neighbors there, if they do have a problem. That's all.
Really looking for questions before we move into deliberations. Are there any other questions? Does everybody have their questions pretty much answered, so we're ready to deliberate? Okay. Let's move then to the issue at hand, the approval of the proposed modification. And Commissioner Boyson, you're up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm very supportive of this project. I'm just a little uncomfortable, and I just want to make this mention to staff. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but the idea that this got onto the consent agenda, and I understand it's a little bit less expensive to go the consent agenda route and this sort of thing, and that's fine. That's fine. But maybe what we need to do is have a different fee schedule for nonprofit community organizations than we do for private enterprise, or something along that line. But this is not a consent agenda item, obviously. We knew going into this thing that there was going to be more discussion than a normal consent agenda, and that's all I'm going to say on that. We need to be very careful with how we use that. I'd hate to think that the public process may have been shortcutted for any reason, that somebody missed this item because they don't pick it up off the consent agenda and that sort of thing. The other thing, though, that I do have concern, Ms. Collins made mention that the girls that use, or the youth that use this facility may be the planning commissioners of tomorrow, and I would hope that this organization encourages a higher standard of morals than that. But having said that, I am supportive of the project and look forward to a favorable motion.
Commissioner Smizer.
See, he's ready to leave, and already he's questioning our moral integrity here. I tell you. I won't take back all those nice comments I made about him, because they really are true. You know, obviously, I'm going to be taking a lot of my lead from the commissioner from that district. This is a project that's going to benefit the youth of the entire South County, and that's clear. So I really want to hear what those two commissioners have to say. I will say that recreation and our youth is a concern of mine. Certainly in the San Ynez Valley, we're trying to remedy some of the similar situations for outside fields and opportunities for our youth. You know, a couple of the speakers kind of tugged at my heartstrings a little bit, because I had a daughter that experienced a lot of maturity and learning about herself and about expanding her horizons through athletics and sports that she wouldn't have done, I don't think, had she not had those opportunities. So it really it troubles me that we don't have those kinds of facilities available on an expansive basis for the girls in South County. So, but I'm going to take my lead from my other two commissioners.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, but Commissioner Smizer, you're the other commissioner being in the 3rd District. So we need to hear from you.
Thank you. All right. Well, then in that case, if you're going to include me, thank you very much. You know, it's interesting because when my wife was superintendent of Carpinteria Schools, Unified School District, I had a lot of actually experience with Girls Inc. And found it to be an excellent program. I know that the school district really relied on that relationship with Girls Inc. And benefited through it. And up in the San Ynez Valley, where I live in the city of Solvang, we have a veterans building that is used by a number of nonprofit and for-profit groups. And the time limit on that, I believe we have a restriction of 11 o'clock in the evening. It's not a problem. They do use there is an agreement that is written out from the city of Solvang who basically controls that facility. But the city does not send a city person to stand there and watch the event and then close up. Typically what happens is the individuals come, they get a key, they're responsible to lock up, and if they fail to do so, it'll be the last time they ever use the facility. So we also have the cooperation, and you would probably have the same thing, I'm sure, in where this facility is, of local law enforcement, kind of trying to keep an eye on those areas where people congregate. They do that in the valley. I know they do it down in South County. And so I thank you, Commissioner, because you're absolutely right. This is a facility that will be used by the citizens of Goleta, be used by folks in Isla Vista, and though that is part of our constituent base, and for that reason, my feeling would be to support the project. I understand the concern about noise that was raised by one of the members of the community. I do think that I agree with Commissioner Valencia that if a number that it may be wise for Girls Inc. to have a number that any community member can call concerning a complaints about the facility, and that could be a 24-hour number. You could also, we have the same thing in the city for a 24-hour number where people can call and issue a complaint, which is checked on a regular basis. but it, as one of you said, it is a process where you kind of have to feel your way through. And I don't blame Girls Inc. for not having all of the details worked out ahead of time, because it is one of those pieces where you go step by step and you include community partners as you go, and they'll develop those policies as they go. And I believe they've got a great track record and reputation that I could trust. So I'm supporting the project.
Thanks, Commissioner Smizer. Commissioner Brown, would you like me to give you my thoughts before you? All right, I will indicate at the outset that I have a strong bias in favor of youth athletics in general, and certainly the need for facilities on the South Coast is well known to everyone who's either raised children or participated in youth activities at any level. So I have no doubt the speakers that came today have an earnest desire to see us recognize that need. But I really feel the focus should be on that increment of activity that is added to what a prior planning commission already approved. We're not questioning the noise made by young girls and their coaches during normal Girls Inc. activities, which go virtually every day. We're really talking about adding another community center aspect to the use. And when we do that, I think we have to be mindful of the impact on the surrounding neighbors. In my view, it will be minimal, but it will be something. And what we don't want is to have a structure where, because this is a conditional use permit, the only outlet for neighbor concerns is to come to the county and suggest that the conditional use permit itself be reopened, because we certainly don't like to do that, to spend everybody's time down here. So in the interests of addressing neighbor concerns at the time and by Girls Inc., I really do think a very thought-through plan of how contact can be made at any point to have redress given to a situation is going to be in everybody's best interest, and the Planning Commission will not be involved in the future concerns of the neighbors. I do think the design of the permanent facility is going to alleviate some of the immediate concerns, but with regard to community activities occurring later in the evening, I have a question as to whether 10 o'clock is the right time, whether we shouldn't agree with the neighbors to cut off activities at 9:30 with the idea that at the noise, the residual noise, if you will, would be completely cleared up by 10 o'clock. I don't feel strongly about it, Commissioner Brown. I'll leave that to you. But if you feel the condition should be modified to that degree, I would certainly support it.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments and your understanding that this is indeed a very worthwhile community project. And for me, I can't tell you how impressed I was with the building and the effort that has been made to address neighbors' concerns in terms of noise attenuation and orientation of the building. And even the parking, in addition, Mr. Tuttle forgot to mention that part of the project conditions are a shuttle for overflow parking should there be a need for additional parking spaces. And the Girls Inc. Has indicated that that's not a problem to incorporate that should there be use of the facility that exceeds this 95 parking spaces. I would like to consider, based upon Commissioner's comments, two things. The first thing is that I think it's really critical to have somebody, if there is a complaint, that a neighbor can call a phone number and somebody pick up the phone and say, we're making too much noise, we're beyond the hours, or something. I think it's very frustrating to have the experience that Commissioner Valencia has, where you get an endless phone tree and nobody to pick it up, especially during evening hours. So if there is a problem, and it may not even be a problem that's attributed to the people using the facility, it may be somebody outside who has no relationship with the group using the facility, and it might give them some heads up that there's a problem. So I would like to see that there is a phone number, an evening phone number, where one of the groups or a Girls Inc. employee would be able to pick up that phone and be responsive to the community. So I'm sure that Girls Inc. will have an evening phone number that can be piped into the gym, and somebody knows that they need to be able to pick up that phone. I do agree about the evening hours. I think that perhaps reducing it from 10 o'clock to 9:30 might be useful, but I'm not quite sure what that might mean in terms of usage of the facility. In terms, if you had a theater group use it, the 9:30 hour is plays go on at 7 and end at 9:30, quarter of 10. I'm just wondering if that would really limit their ability to use it. I am mindful that we do have neighbors that people spilling out into a parking lot at 10:30, not cleared out of there by, say, 11, might indeed be a problem just because of noise. So I'm willing to leave the 10 p.m. hour, but I do think it's important that we have somebody available by phone for the entire operating hours of the gymnasium. And Ms. Meester, you look like you were going to... No, okay. So that would be my only thought, that that concluding the operating hours by 9:30 may limit the use of the library and this wonderful theater, which there is certainly no theater of this size and of this nature in the Goleta Valley, which I think will be really a very attractive addition to the community. And I think that a theater may bring in a different type of venue than the rock group that I had asked about if they would be using the facility, and I assured that they would not be using it. So I think that the 10 p.m. Closing hour would be satisfactory. I'm wondering if we need to have any sort of look-back provision after this operation is fully completed and fully staffed and fully functioning after a certain period of time, to see whether or not there are any problems. Ms. Meester.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, first of all, Mr. Tuttle does have a condition that he has drafted that can address the phone issue. With regard to some sort of review of this facility, my recommendation would be that we bring this to your commission if we see an issue. It will be in permit compliance. We'll be reviewing it. I just hate to have Girls Inc. have to pay for another hearing before the Planning Commission to tell you everything's going okay.
No, I wasn't thinking of that. I was just thinking that we would hear from permit compliance that there were no problems, or there was a problem, and then that would start a different path. That's my only thoughts.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, I will certainly let you know if there is a problem.
Okay.
And if you want to call me and ask me if there is, I'll let you know that there isn't too.
And I think that I believe that Girls Inc. will be good neighbors, and that they will provide information to their adjacent neighbors about phone numbers, about complaints, and other types of issues that may arise, and hopefully there won't be any.
So why don't we have Mr. Tuttle go ahead and read the language.
Okay. Let's hear the language of the condition to see if it meets our need, and then we'll hear from Girls Inc. as to whether it's acceptable.
That's fine.
Mr. Tuttle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. This is a first take at it. Girls Inc. shall provide a dedicated manned phone number for receipt of complaints regarding use of the facility. Complaints shall be acted upon appropriately. And certainly we could add additional language to that, but that's the basics.
Mr. Tuttle, it would be my intention that it's during all operational hours, and I think that needs to be made clear in that revised condition, because they can have it with that condition, it could just be cut off at 6, but I think it needs to be during all operational hours, unless
So while the facility is being used, essentially.
Correct.
All right, that's the gist of it. It may be refined with a little more thought, but how does that strike you?
That
Ms.
strikes me,
Howe-Grant?
I'm Mary Howe Grant. I think that's fine. I have one little objection, and you'll probably find this very interesting, but I would prefer that the word manned were taken out and the word person to put in. Thank you. Otherwise, no, we have absolutely no problem with that.
Certainly, that's an easy change to make and
Thank you very
appropriate.
much.
Extremely appropriate.
I thought so under this circumstance. Thank you very much. We're
Thank you.
happy to do that.
All right. Well, I think we're ready to go to a motion if Commissioner Brown is prepared to offer it. Let me ask Commissioner Boyson, did you have something?
You
on
know,
that?
I was just going to make one suggestion. I know back in the day, and it goes back several years, and I'm sure they probably already thought of this, but these 724 security services too are available, that if somebody does call to complain, they're ready to send somebody out immediately and this sort of thing. So, I mean, that could probably solve the problem, but I just kind of throw that out.
We already will have a 24/7 alarm system. And
Right.
so it's no problem to go one step further.
We're really looking for an outlet for a concerned neighbor or other citizen to reach you and let you know of their concern.
And I would bet you that probably in your gym you can do call forwarding so that somebody using the gym, the phone rings, they can pick it up. So that's my only thought, is that there is a phone, that there's not an answering machine at the end of it. There's a person, whether it be a man or a woman, who can pick up that phone, or even a girl. Okay, so with that, unless there's any other comments from my commissioners, I would like to move the staff recommendation with the additional condition.
Is there a second?
I will second that.
Commissioner Smizer seconds. Further discussion? Commissioners, any last thoughts? We're ready to go then. Ms. Contreras?
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
Congratulations, all of you. You do wonderful work. We appreciate getting to know you a little better, and good luck with the rest of the building and your future activities. We'll have just a very brief break. I know that a number of people are here for our next item, which is the The next item is the Urban Oak Tree Guidelines. We'll take that up right at 11 o'clock. Thank you. Regular agenda item number 2.
Mr. Chair, actually, I think we need to read and accept the withdrawal of item number 1.
All right. Ms. Contreras, item number 1, will you read that into the record, please?
Thank you. The following is a hearing on the request of Santa Barbara County Flood Control and Water Conservation District to consider case number 06GOV30, application filed on December 15, 2006, for determination pursuant to Government Code Section 65402 is consistent with the comprehensive plan of the County of Santa Barbara.
Ms. Black, the only comment I would make is that this was pretty late in the process, so I'm sure members of the commission read the staff report and became familiar with it. Not that isn't going to be of value in the future, but it is nice when we can determine the state of the agenda earlier than the day before. Were there circumstances here that prevented that?
Mr. Chair, it just evolved into a withdrawal. So, yes and no. Unfortunately, we just didn't know this is what flood control wanted to do until probably late Monday.
Do we need a motion? All right. Does one of you want to make a motion
Sure.
to accept the withdrawal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make a motion to accept the withdrawal of item number 1.
In second.
Ms. Contreras?
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Boyson?
Aye.
Commissioner Smizer?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
Item 2, you will read that one next, please.
Thank you. The following is a hearing on the request of Planning and Development Department on behalf of Community Planning Renaissance that the County Planning Commission make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to accept the revised Urban Oak Tree guidelines and direct staff to work on public education.
Mr. Chair, I'm just going to make a few remarks, and then Ms. Saley will do the staff presentation, and then we have 3 people here from Community Planning Renaissance, Laurel Perez, Bob Easton, and Susan Vanetta, who I think also want to address the commission. I think it's noteworthy that the 3 of them are here and continue to be here. We've been working on this item since the fall of 2003, probably actually earlier than that, but really a concerted effort to try and clarify the guidelines since that point. And Community Planning Renaissance has been very supportive and encouraging, and have put a lot of work and their own time into doing this, particularly the 3 people you see here today. Concerns were raised a couple of years ago when we brought this to your commission and then the board about the effect of the regulations, and I think they were on both sides. Are we making the tree protection policies too loose, or are we making them too stringent? And I guess the point I want to make today is that we're just trying to make them understandable, and we're trying to avoid people overreacting to policies that are already on the books in a variety of community plans, the local coastal program, and the county's land use element that call for the protection of oaks. And what we've heard from a number of people is that property owners, are concerned about their oaks, and instead of wanting to preserve them, remove them in anticipation that they will be a problem in permitting relatively simple developments on their property. We're not talking about discretionary development necessarily. We're really talking about people who come in and either want to build a house on a lot or an addition. So we're really just trying to get the commission and ultimately the Board of Supervisors to accept a public brochure that helps to try and explain a myriad of policies that exist on the books. We're not trying to change those policies. We're really not even trying to reinterpret them. We're just trying to make them clearer and hopefully help the public understand that they should value their oaks and protect them, and we'll work with them to work them into their developments. So you might be able to tell I'm getting kind of tired because we have been working on this for a long time. So I'm really hopeful that we can move forward, because I don't want to lose the energy and enthusiasm that the people sitting at the table across from me have displayed, and their desire to get these in effect so that they can tell their clients honestly that the county will work with them. So that's our intention today.
Good morning, Ms. Saley.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Just to elaborate a little bit on the recent review process for these guidelines. Back in July, 2 weeks running, we went to the County Planning Commission, your commission, and we went before the Montecito Planning Commission, and it was interesting. The Montecito Commission was more interested in expanding the scope of review, and your commission was of the mind that let's focus on the problem, which is primarily, or it is pretty much exclusively, coast live oaks on the south coast, and by extension in the urban area. And we have taken that very seriously. These are pretty lean and mean guidelines, down to 2 pages. Graphics, we still will make them look a little prettier and better pictures and such, but our goal here is to focus on the issue, the thing that we feel is somewhat broken or at least partially damaged. We'd like to fix it. At your request, Subsequent to that July workshop, we met with the specialists. They were landscape architects, botanists, Bill Spiewak, Mark de la Garza, Susan Van Atta was part of that meeting. We had Lottie Martin, who's with the Ag Commissioner's Office, specializes in these things. Melissa Mooney, who is a biologist, as you well know, in the North County office, and we had a couple-hour meeting talking about the issues that the two commissions had raised. And these folks had worked on what we affectionately call PIT 2, the earlier effort, so they were very knowledgeable. They gave their opinions. We modified the guidelines, again, always with the mind to keep them as simple as possible. Bounced them off them. Once again, they were fine with what we've done. We also sent them to representatives of the Environmental Defense Center and Darlene Sherman, who's a botanist, does a lot of work in this area. They made some suggestions that were good. We've incorporated them. We've tried hard to not go for the lowest common denominator, but always stay with what makes sense, what implements the guidelines, and we've tried to put these guidelines in a positive vein instead of what is perceived as a negative vein, not a thou shalt not, but here is the process and here are the steps. And the reception we've gotten is that we've been successful in that. The Oversight Committee has been sort of the common factor throughout this process. Generally, just as Ms. Black said, we've spent a lot of time on these. When it comes up on the agenda, it's sort of, are we still talking about the guidelines? Because we think we're ready to move on, so hopefully we can. The guidelines would apply in the urban area only. If you wish to see a map of the South Coast showing the urban areas, we have that here. Coast live oaks, valley and blue oaks or trees are always measured at breast height. That's a standard measure. For coast live oaks, 6 inches and greater, valley and blue oaks, 4 inches. This really, though, is focused on the coast live oaks. And only where a permit is required, that is a very important factor. If someone is coming to the county for some sort of permit, then the guidelines would be reviewed and considered. One of the issues, probably one of the largest issues with the earlier sort of informal guidelines, was at what point is a tree protection report required, an arborist report. And the critical root zone method had been used in recent years, and I think we talked about that back in July. And it's not rocket science really to figure out where is that critical root zone, but there isn't a logical correlation necessarily between the drip line and where that zone might be. It's a lot of factors, the age of the tree, the soil conditions, lots of things. That just added to the uncertainty. And prior to maybe about 5 years ago, the county had used drip line plus, I think, 6 feet. And that was a much clearer measure. And we are proposing to go back to that. We are proposing 5 feet. It's sort of a more logical number. It's used by many, many, many jurisdictions, so we're going for standardization. But it's very clear. Pretty much everyone would come up with the same line around a tree of drip line plus 5 feet. The report would be required if the proposed project that requires a permit could possibly encroach into that drip line plus 5 feet. That is very black and white, and that's one of the things we were trying to achieve here, is get rid of the uncertainty as to when this report is required. And the report's purpose is to look at what the impacts might be and suggest mitigations. And if replacement planning is needed, and that would be included maintenance. You had commented that you did not want to see the requirement that an appraisal of the tree be included, and you did not want to see bonding as a requirement necessarily. There's still some discretion there, but not as a requirement. These 5 priorities, and they are listed in priority order, are embedded in the county's policies relating to oaks, and this is no change from what previously was in the informal guidelines that were being used. Relocation, excuse me, is treated as removal. Even though the state of the art has improved, generally the prognosis for the tree is not so great. So it's, even if an applicant is proposing to move a tree, it's treated as relocation. We feel that's consistent with the existing policies. So just in closing, very short presentation. The next steps, hear what the commission has to say today, make any modifications you may feel are necessary. We're asking that you make a recommendation to the board that they accept the guidelines. We will publish the guidelines brochure. We'll have copies at the counter, on the website, etc. And then we'd like to do an education campaign in concert with CPR. It's really important we get this word out to especially architects, engineers, people who work in particular on the South Coast. So with that, take any questions, or we could hear from CPR members first if you'd like.
We have two speakers, two of the three members of the Renaissance group have indicated they want to speak, and also Bob Field. So why don't we start with you, and then Mr. Field can add his comments. So Laurel Perez, you're the first of the speakers in that group.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Laurel Perez, and I'm a member of Community Planning Renaissance. And we've been working on this effort to simplify and make clear the county's existing tree protection guidelines that are applied to projects when a project requires a permit. And we've been working on this effort for the past couple of years because the existing guidelines are confusing and unclear to most people, and impart a sense of mistrust in the process. And the unfortunate consequence of this has been the removal of trees before applicants submit applications because they're fearful of the process that they will face and the county's response to proposed development within or near oak trees, urban oak trees on their properties. And I noticed that staff has included the existing tree protection policy paper, which was prepared in 2002 and distributed to staff to help advise them and guide them in the review of these applications. This is a paper that's also made its way into the public realm and is provided to applicants. If you've taken the time to read through it, it's quite a few pages long. It's unclear. It's subjective in some cases. And our effort has been not to create new policy to replace existing tree protection policy and community plans, and not to change existing policy, but rather to work with what has happened in the past, past practices with respect to tree protection, and simplify those elements and create a brochure that's very clear to understand that would replace this tree protection policy paper that is currently being used and what we believe improve the outcome for the protection of urban oak trees. So with that, I think I'll pass the mic over to Bob Easton and to Susan Van Atta, who are here with me today from CPR.
Mr. Easton, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Laurel. I think we've been over this before here at your meeting. It was previously about 6 months ago, I guess. And we explained why we were here at that time, that we weren't here to make more laws. I'm certainly not in favor of more regulations and more government, but I am trying to look at the reality of the circumstance, and that is there are guidelines at the Planning and Development Department in regard to how people deal with oak trees, and it has created, as Laurel said, a lot of distrust and people are afraid. They're afraid to plant oak trees, or afraid to think that they can build near oak trees, and therefore people, and we've all heard this before, people have cut down those trees before they've gone in for their permits. So we're here to save oak trees and come up with a program that is realistic. Now, was originally a little hesitant to think about advocating that people that have to deal with oak trees would have to commission a report. But I think that all in all, that's a very positive approach, because by submitting a report, we should be able to communicate that to the public, that by hiring an arborist or an approved person that I'll mention here in a few minutes, and having that report done, then you will be able to preserve your oak trees and do what you want to do on your property within reason and with respect to those oak trees. And therefore, people hopefully will not continue to believe that they have to cut them down first. And so what we're trying to do is, with this change, as Laurel mentioned, have a public relations campaign and say, look, we don't have this critical root zone situation anymore, which I think a lot of people, they hear that word critical root zone and they think they're going in for a critical root canal in the twilight zone, and it's just, we want to get rid of that. And the drip line is a realistic procedure that works and has worked for years, and as Ms. Saley pointed out, used in a lot of communities here in Southern California, the whole Southern California area. So I think we've got a good program here. Now, I hope you've all read the document that we have created here, but there have been some things here that we do want to revise in this. So if you would take this and look at what is maybe page 2, but it's supposed to be page 1, because this will be a folded little brochure, and the page that begins with introduction and purpose. Come down to the logo, what is a tree protection zone? The note that is under the graphic that mentions, when it is evident that a tree has recently been pruned, the drip line may be inferred from photographs or other data. We want to remove that statement, because I'd like to see, and certainly in my opinion, and I believe in everybody's opinion here, that we need to reduce the iffiness of comments in this brochure. I think that the brochure will have credibility with the public if it's concrete. And I think that people have been known to go and try to prune the tree to reduce the drip line, so that would cut down the spread of the critical root zone. However, I think that everything that I've heard from talking to arborists and people, if somebody does trim down the perimeter of an oak tree, it doesn't really damage the oak tree. It's not like going in and cutting out roots. Certainly, if people know that they have a policy at the county that is going to be they're able to work with the county, they will be less likely to want to go and prune and trim that oak tree. The other part of that note, which says where a tree is leaning and doesn't have much foliage on one side, the entire tree protection zone shall be based on the widest drip line plus 5 feet of the tree. We want to eliminate that also, because that goes in the iffy category, and you've got people then speculating as to what the drip line or the root area of that tree is going to be, and I think those two comments in that note section should be eliminated, because it creates confusion and creates iffiness that I think will deter people from wanting to participate in this program. Going up to the middle column, then, where it says tree report guidelines, the second bullet point, which says the tree report must be prepared by a ISA certified arborist, a qualified biologist, or a registered professional forester with 3 or 4 years of preferably local experience, is a good thing. I know we've talked about how do we qualify the person writing the report, and I think this is a good these are good comments here to qualify that person. However, if you go to the next page and you go down to section number 5 that says replacement as the logo, and you go down, I believe it's in the second sentence, it goes on, the second sentence says, the size and number of trees planted depends on the size and health of trees lost, is determined by county-approved professional. We want to eliminate that comment. We don't want the county planning department to have a list of approved people. They have had that in the past, and people get put on the list and taken off the list. And I think that as long as that report is prepared by the ISA certified arborist, a qualified biologist, or a registered professional forester, that's going to be security enough that the report is being prepared by a professional person who is concerned about their reputation and is going to do an honest job. The paragraph goes on, the sentence that I just read goes on to say, and as approved by P&D staff. What we would like to have that paragraph say is not that that arborist report will be approved by P&D staff only. If the P&D staff gets the report and feels that it is not proper, we want to have that report submitted for peer review. And I think that what I'm suggesting here is that the report, if it's questionable at all, is not just reviewed only by P&D staff, but could be reviewed also by a peer review. Now, if the peer review comes back and it's still in question, then the staff person can say this is questionable and deny the report, and then the owner or client can decide what to do in terms of appeal. But I think that would, it's actually continue a practice that the county has done for years anyway, which is submit certain aspects for peer review. All right, then moving back to the first page, as we move down that middle column under tree report guidelines, and under the subsection that says tree report contents, the third bullet point says identify number of replacement trees of the same species as the impacted tree and from local genetic stock. What we've all agreed it should read, and from local genetic stock where feasible. There may be a number of conditions where it is not feasible or possible to get local genetic stock, and should be some flexibility in how that is handled. Moving on to the third column and talking about section number 3, relocation, at the bottom of that column. The third sentence in the middle of the paragraph says a maintenance plan is required to ensure survival of the tree for a minimum of 3 years. If the tree dies, it must be replaced with a tree of comparable value and maintained to ensure survival. What we would like to do is add a comment after a tree of comparable value and say with a tree of comparable value or a number of other appropriately sized trees, because there's a number of circumstances where someone cannot replace a tree of comparable value. If the tree is put in place and it's installed behind a building and there's no longer access to the building and the tree dies, there has to be another alternative that that person can do. And I think that it's a vague area there, perhaps. However, that would just have to be determined as by an arborist who wrote the original report, hopefully, and the maintenance people who are involved in the maintenance plan, and with perhaps the county to determine what is an appropriate replacement. Moving on then to the second page under paragraph 5, replacement. First sentence says where a tree protection report is required and replacement is proposed, replacement is required at a ratio of up to 10 oaks of an appropriate size per tree lost. That's a standard of the guidelines now with a 10 oak replacement, and those oaks are typically allowed to be 15-gallon oaks. And I think that appropriate size per tree lost is maybe too vague. It would be good to specify perhaps 15-gallon oaks as a replacement. And those are basically comments, but I would go on to add that we should add a section in here which would encourage people to plant oak trees. A number of people don't want to plant oak trees to put them on their landscape plan because it might affect future development of their property. And I think if we mention here that if you plant oak trees and it's part of an approved landscape plan and it's part of the record is on that landscape plan, then you have the ability to go in and cut those down if you have to build in that location, or to add on to a room, or to put a driveway or something there. You should be able to be in charge of the trees that you plant. And so I think the mechanism of having a submitted landscape plan would be appropriate there to avoid any confusion or trouble in the future. But anyway, I think that making these changes makes something here, makes a report, or makes a brochure and a policy, a guideline here that I certainly can support, and I think CPR can support, and help bring to the public and introduce not only to the professionals of architecture and engineering, land use, but also to the real estate people, and to generally get it out to the community through the newspapers and be active in explaining it to people. And certainly we were willing to do that if we've got a report and if we have a set of guidelines here that we can really support. I think it's a very positive thing that we can do this because it'll really, I think, help the community. So Susan, do you want to say something?
Well, as a landscape architect, I would just like to reiterate the two reasons I got involved with this process. And one is that I was aware that either people would want to remove trees, and perhaps would remove trees in order to not lose value of their land, or contemplate it, not do it, and possibly regret later that they hadn't removed their tree. But none of the unintended consequences of the guidelines that are currently used by staff really went towards, I think, actually protecting trees in the long run. And then a very strong concern to me as a landscape architect is that I can tell you without question that people do not want me to call for planting of new oak trees on their property, because it is now perceived that having an oak tree on your property takes away its all of its development potential. And those are the strong unintended consequences of the current guidelines. I have been involved with this process and following it all along. And I'd like to comment on what Bob had to say. I felt the same way Diane does, that I'm a little worn out too. And so these guidelines may not be exactly what I would come up with if I wrote them myself, but I thought close enough and will go towards avoiding these unintended consequences. But today when Bob brought up, I hadn't paid that close of attention to the note underneath the what is a tree protection zone diagram. I guess I just thought it's a note, just a sidebar, and I think, and Diane could correct me if I'm wrong, it might have been in order to address some of the concerns that were brought up by people during the process. But that note that says where it is evident that a tree has recently been pruned, the drip line may be inferred from photographs or other data, I think is actually will result in unintended consequences, and that it detracts from, I think, the greatest benefit of this existing guideline. The brochure that's been developed is that it's really simple, and the simpler you keep it, the easier it is for people to understand, not just the public, but also staff, because staff will continue to evolve over time, and or change rather, and we hope they evolve too. But that the more you get into the particulars about situations that cannot be anticipated, the more trouble you cause for yourself in the future. The problem I see with the first sentence of the note is that it could cause a person who loves their tree and for the purposes solely of health of the tree, because trees do benefit from being pruned for their health, could be then regarded suspiciously for their activity. And worse yet, any of you who are really familiar with aerial photographs know that they are not taken directly above a property typically, And so the chances of a photographic representation of a drip line from an aerial photograph being correct is very small. And then you could get into a huge hornet's nest of problems. And so I think if you just deleted this note altogether, you'd avoid a lot of problems. And just a quick, I also think that the second reference to leaning trees and coming up with a solution on how to address leaning trees is better addressed on an individual basis in the tree report by the arborist, because the reason that a tree is leaning would be clearly evident to an arborist, and the arborist could address that in the report and would be in a good position to provide some educated information regarding why that tree leans and where the roots may go from there. But all that aside, the idea behind this is to allow people to work with their oak trees when they have one, and to value them and incorporate an oak tree into their daily life, which I'm sure they would love to do, to when they go to build a house, celebrate that oak tree, in a courtyard. And right as it now stands, the interpretation of the ordinances and so forth and all of the general plans that protect oak trees is that you have to stay away from that tree. I don't think that is what protects a tree, is avoiding it completely. And just one last point, it has been my experience over the years that when people go to develop a home, and if it's in and around or near an oak tree, that oak tree a lot of times for the first time ever gets care. And so I have often seen trees that are, just barely getting by, and when they are pruned and they're incorporated into a new homescape, that they are quite valued, that those trees start to flourish as they hadn't for a long time.
Laurel, you wanted to add before?
I do.
Okay.
I
go
do.
ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, just really quickly, the effort that we are attempting is really one to help create trust between applicants and the public review process. And so that is always at the forefront of our thinking here and our goal. Secondly, I just wanted to add that the measures that Bob was reviewing with you that are contained within this brochure only kick in when you are encroaching into the tree drip line. I think that's something to keep in mind. And then finally, the measures that are identified in this brochure aren't new measures. They are measures that have been employed in the past by county staff and are used on a regular basis. They're just not codified anywhere. They're just not clearly spelled out in black and white. And so sometimes they're used, sometimes they're not. There's some subjectivity depending on who your planner may be. This brochure demystifies the process, clearly identifies, you're good if you're outside of that tree drip line. If you go within and encroach within the tree drip line, you're going to have to provide the report, and this is what it will have to contain. And these are the types of mitigation measures that will be applied. And so that's merely what we're after here. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Let's hear from Mr. Field, and then we'll come back for comments and questions.
Thank you. My name is Bob Field. I live in Santa Ynez. I actually had only planned to make a complimentary comment regarding to process issues that are raised here, but I now have two questions about the program itself, so let me do that, and I'll save the other for later, or maybe I have time. With regard to pruning trees, I'm an amateur take care of your own trees guys and talk to tree people about how to care for them. And I'm told with oak trees that 30% is about the maximum cut that you should do at any one period of time, and that you want to, in the cutting, retain a balance in the tree. Now, most of the things that are going to infringe are going to come from one side. And if somebody takes 30 or 40% of a tree off one side of an oak tree, you've got a really significant hit to the health and the future of that tree. So to completely ignore pruning, and I'm not sure this or other codes do. Yeah, you see my point, though. I didn't research this. I don't know what I'm talking about. But unrestricted pruning of oak trees.
Did we get a record of that statement?
Yeah, I said it for your pleasure and future use. The other one is on the cutting down oak trees that you voluntarily plant. That was part of the oak tree revision ordinance that I got peripherally involved in a couple of years ago. I think there needs to be an exception made here. If oak trees have been planted for mitigation of prior issues, I don't think you should have the same freedom to just take them out. I've planted probably 50 oak trees on my place, and I know what you mean. You got to think about where you put them. But if it's a tree that's in for mitigation, I think that's just clearly a different issue. Do I have a minute on the? Pardon? Oh yeah, well it's an adjacent comment. Let me the staff report mentions, I think, 6 different community plans, and as former VPAC chairman in Santa Ynez, I have to ask what happened to the Santa Ynez plan, and then let me spit them both out at once, and then kind of and what's an urban area? You know, in the Santa Ynez community plan we have an urban boundary. So inside that, is that an urban area? And then we have inner rural and rural, and it said it's a South Coast issue, but we've got an urban area in the Santa Ynez plan. What's that? And then the global question, I'm on my yellow light, I'm going for it. If all these community plans have language relating to oak trees in them, and they may be somewhat different from each other, if a global change can be made to oak trees that affects all of the community plans in the county without having gone through the community plan process, then what was the purpose of the community plan there and the local control? Bigger issue, an example I spoke to you about earlier, is the expanded home occupation. In the Santa Ynez Valley Community Plan area, there are 1,800 ag-zoned parcels. Can someone change the definition of what you can do on ag zoning to allow 1,200 square foot businesses within a community plan area without taking that proposal through the community plan process? Could we change the height limit in C2 from 35 feet to 85 feet without going through the community plan processes? Could you change residential zoning from 1 house per whatever square feet to 3 or 4 homes per whatever square feet of land without going through the community plan processes? And the global question, which I've asked before, is if you can do things like that, then what is a community plan? What is the point of it? Why should anybody work on one if they can be changed so dramatically from outside with no notice at all? Thank you.
Good questions, Mr. Field. Thank you. As
I'm
always.
commonly told that's a good question, and I always respond, I know, I'm looking for a good answer.
Well, I can't promise that.
Well, I know, and I'm just trying to water that seed here. I know you're not going to answer that one today, but it's symptomatic of what I think is a really big issue for the county.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ms. Black, we'll give you the first shot here.
Thanks. Mr. Chair, first of all, I wanted to generally comment on the issues that Mr. Easton raised, because I think by and large they were good ones. And I think the intention of this brochure is to set the general rule and not every single exception to the rule that could be made on a case-by-case basis. And so I agree that the footnote that refers to the effect of pruning is confusing and not necessary. Individual cases will arise where specific review will occur, but I think we need to set a general rule and we need to set a really positive tone, and that was the purpose of the brochure. So, I'm fine with that. With respect to the list of qualified professionals, I think Mr. Easton's right. What you see before you is a product of people who have reviewed this so many times they can't even see specific provisions, and I think Susan indicated that. I'm certainly guilty of it. I think Pat's guilty of it, and also a lot of group editing. And so things go in, we decide to take them out, they go back in. So I agree that referring to a P&D approved list of approved consultants isn't the appropriate way to reference it in this document. I'm fine with the list of professionals that are qualified to prepare these reports. Likewise, on the peer review issue, rather than saying that these reports can be reviewed by P&D staff, I mean, that's obvious. There's no need to state the obvious here. There's going to be a planner on these projects. They'll be processing the permit because this is only in a permit context. And I think it is important for people to understand that peer review may be required in certain cases, probably not most, but in certain cases. So I'm perfectly happy with those suggestions, because what we're really trying to do is just to make it clear that this is a relatively simple process. The rules are fairly clear. So on that note, I understand the desire to let people know that if they plant a tree, they're not going to be penalized in the future. I have some concerns about the expectation that's set that we're somehow monitoring the planting of oak trees in this county in the urban areas and are able to account for that. So I'm just raise that as kind of a general concern. I think the brochure is fine without it. If we can add it in a way that provides some comfort to people, that's fine, because it's certainly our intent. But we're not going to have some humongous monitoring program like was contemplated in the rural oak tree program. We don't want to really get into that because we're a big county and it would be a difficult thing to do. With respect to Mr. Fields' comments on the pruning issue, I think everybody knows if you prune a tree too much, it's going to affect the health of the tree, and we'll address that through permitting if necessary, but I think people won't tend to do that, and we haven't seen much of that in the past. Urban areas are defined in our comprehensive plan, and I think Pat does have a slide of South Coast urban areas, and I don't know what color is what here, but I think it's basically
Pink is incorporated cities.
You can't use the mouse. Can't see it.
it's a bit faded, and I know the colors don't work, but the shaded area on this map.
It's clear as mud for me.
Yeah, you can't see.
Anyway, it's the areas when we identify in every staff report you see what area of the area of the county a project is located in, whether it's urban, inner rural, or rural. And those are our three classifications. What we're really talking about are projects associated with single-family homes in addition to single-family homes in urban areas. So in Hope Ranch, in Montecito, in some areas in Toro, in those sort of urban enclaves, Mission Canyon. What we're not talking about is Tepiscay or the unincorporated Lompoc Valley, in the rural area of Lompoc, or rural Santa Ynez. That's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about urban type development. With respect to the global change to policies through, I heard a couple of examples. One were ordinance amendments. This sort of leads to a philosophical question about the role of community plans and the level of specificity in a community plan. And Pat and I looked at the community plan policies that have been adopted, and the reason we didn't attach Santa Ynez is because, as you know, that community plan has not been adopted, nor has Isla Vista, so we didn't incorporate those policies yet into the attachment to your staff report. But with respect to community plans, I think community plans ought to indicate that certain resources and certain issues are important to a community and generally what they want to see. But when you get to the level of detailing how a tree is to be measured to protect it, it's going a little bit further than I think the intent of community plans is. And that plan does include that language right now. And so that's something we may want to look at. Some of the other adopted community plans talk about drip line, but in more general terms, that the tree should generally be protected around its drip line or whatever. So it's really more a philosophical level of detail issue. I certainly wouldn't recommend that we change the height of structures in the Santa Ynez area to 100 feet without going into the Santa Ynez community. So I think it's just really a matter of what the issue is, how important it is to the community, how detailed you want to be in a community plan versus in the area where you typically are and you're implementing ordinances and practices. So anyway, that's how I would at least try to address that question.
Well, that's certainly part of a bigger discussion, but it just was raised, I'm sure, in the context of what we're doing here. But we're not amending an ordinance here. We're basically talking about trying to clarify some issues that are very important and widespread in
Right.
terms of urban development. So in that direction, I think we need to decide whether the fact that staff and the contributors have been so worn out by the process means that we have no choice but to go forward with what's been proposed, or at least what I'd like to see is the revisions that have been suggested that staff supports come back to us in a black line form or red line form, so we can see the changes where they go. Some are proposed and you seem to support on behalf of staff. Others you question, and we can have a discussion of that. But I think it's important enough and will be a useful enough tool that we should get it right, notwithstanding that that there's been a great deal of review up to now. So with that, let me hear from, do you have something to add right in that context?
Well, Mr. Chair, I have a suggestion. If you want to see what these changes would look like, it's nearly noon anyway. We could bring them back if we're going to continue into the
Mr.
afternoon because
Chair.
we do
Yeah,
have another item.
Mr. Chair, were you going to open up to the commission? Because I have many, many questions that I would like to ask of members at the table.
Of course.
and-
No,
and
I didn't mean to cut off
Okay,
discussion.
fine.
I was kind of giving an overview
Okay.
in terms of where we are and where we might go today. So I think if the goal is to have full adoption, at the very least, following our discussion, we'd have to have a recess to allow that to occur. But it wasn't clear to me which ones were supported and which ones weren't. So let's go to the commissioners at this point. All of you have comments, and to the extent that members of the Renaissance Group can answer the questions or dialogue, I think we should be a little more liberal to try and be efficient. Commissioner Valencia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one short question. When we approved a track in the 4th District about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, we were concerned with limbing of a tree, oak trees. And this was a development that had about 29 units in it. And it was a consensus on the one objection, but it was a consensus on the Planning Commission that 6 foot was the limit for limbing. And my point is that people are taller than 6 foot. You know, there's people that are 6'2", 6'3", and they're going to bump their heads on these things. And so just in the area where I happen to know a lot of people up there that are 6'4", 6'5", and they came to me and said, what is this that I heard you say that? I said, not me, but the other members. That's what they passed. And limbing was limited to 6 feet. And I noticed that you spoke about pruning, but you didn't talk about limbing. And I think that it should be somewhere around 7 foot. They should be allowed to do that. You know, these trees come down and they have them in their neighborhoods. They have them in their houses, next to their houses, and they can't walk under them. And they have difficulty with that. But you didn't address limbing at all, and I was wondering if you could address that.
Well, I think that we don't want to talk about pruning at all in this brochure. If it comes up during a tree report, if, say, a owner wants to limb the tree, he would discuss that with his arborist or whoever's writing the report, and then that would be submitted to P&D for their review.
Well, no, the commission here said that the trees would not be limbed any more than 6 feet. 6 feet was the limit.
Mr. Chair, we're not trying to limit your commission's discretion. So if you're in the context of a discretionary permit and you choose to set a limit, you have the right to do that. So
I'm not trying to set a limit. I'm trying to get you
Or
that you have
extend it.
discussion on limbing, that it's important that it be one of the things that you talk about pruning, and you talk about that, and I know it's a subset. Excuse me, Mr. Chair, I didn't address you, but it's a subset of pruning, and it's a very important part because in many cases pruning, they're trying to top or take areas off inside the tree, but the limbing is something that occurs a lot in these trees. As the trees grow, the canopy comes down below where they can't walk on it, and they're all concerned about trimming this, and the comments were made again to 6 feet, and
Well, I think, Commissioner Valencia, there's no in the current project, we're focused on giving a guideline to the public, and I think you raised the question whether we need to have anything about pruning or limbing in there. And it's a good question, but as I understand the proposal, it doesn't say what you can and can't do. In a given project context, the commission might decide on a limit, and that'd be an appropriate place to discuss that. Certainly an arborist report might discuss that as well. But let's address the proposed guidelines and then ultimately where we go with them. So Commissioner Smizer, you're next.
Commissioner Cooney, could I make just one more short comment in relation to Commissioner Valencia's thing? On this page, the last page here, we have a section at the end that says other information available. And it says, bullet number 3 says oak growing tips for homeowners brochure. General tips for homeowners, the importance of maintaining surface level around oaks and not watering under oaks. Certainly that information that would be available to people in the standard literature probably talks about limbing, and that's the appropriate place, I think, that is referenced in this particular program here we're talking about.
Commissioner Smizer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, actually, I have a question that maybe goes to the heart of this in a different way. And please forgive me, my fellow commissioners, but my question has to do with why we're recommending to the Board of Supervisors that they accept something that the Board of Supervisors is the only body that will be able to make that decision. I have a problem with our process here. And my question is this: we've spent an awful lot of time discussing this issue. It's going to end up going back to the Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors is going to likely want to go through this entire show again. And I guess I have a question as to why, if first I feel uncomfortable in telling the Board of Supervisors how they should vote on something. It'd be as if I'm going to do a jury trial and I get the judge, I lay out all the facts to the judge first, and it's because I want the judge to tell the jury what he thinks. It doesn't make any sense to me, I have to tell you, and I think it leads to problems that we've seen in the past, in my short tenure here, of recommendations that we send out to the board, and then it goes through a different process, and then there's all kinds of confusion about what we'd said, what we didn't say, whether we had authority, whether we didn't have authority, and I just feel uncomfortable with this process. In terms of economy of the community, I think it's unfair to the community. We have one member of the community other than the CPR here, and at times we've had a whole lot more, but when you hold repeated meetings at the Planning Commission level, I think it just drains, and I've heard staffs that are there drained, and now we're going to do the same thing again over at the Board of Supervisors. So my question is, I'm questioning this process and whether or not when you have something that's going to be heard by the Board of Supervisors for a decision that is not does not have a planning commission element for decision making. We're not the decision making body. Certainly, I don't have a problem with us giving recommendations, perhaps, but this recommendation that I see is it's a hearing on the request of the Planning and Development Department on behalf of the Community Planning Renaissance to recommend the Board of Supervisors accept. That to me means that that's different. Passing on recommendations like these revisions would be one thing. Passing on a recommendation that they accept is different. So I have a little bit of a problem with that, Mr. Chair, and I don't know where to go with that problem.
Thanks, Commissioner Smizer. I do think we need to explore that. Perhaps that's a topic to add to our retreat list, but you will acknowledge that a great deal of this commission's work is in the making of recommendations as opposed to just reviewing project by project. These are sort of county-wide guidelines, and certainly the practice has been that there's a benefit to having it aired at this commission and getting the recommendations of this commission before it goes to the board. If that's a practice we need to change, we should certainly consider it.
Mr. Chair, I agree with you. Let me be specific. It's the wording of this recommendation is that we're telling the board to accept this document. I am uncomfortable with that. I don't have a problem recommending to the board that these changes, that we believe these changes are appropriate, or that we believe this document is an appropriate education tool. I have a problem with this board telling the decision makers that we believe that they should adopt this. And I think part of it is just in terms of what lines of authority we have. I understand that we have a special role in the county, but I think we set ourselves up for the problems that we've seen in the past when then the Board of Supervisors changes this slightly. Are we now in opposition to the Board of Supervisors and what they did? Because we said that this is the document that they should approve? And I think that probably would say, no, not necessarily. So that's where I have the problem. It's in the wording that they adopt this, rather than that that we think this is a worthwhile document that they review and that they make a decision on. That's and I hope I make the distinction clear. It's not the review process. I'm not saying that that's a waste of time.
It's the manner of our recommendation, and whether it is a recommendation is something we should focus on at the time that we adopt a motion, if we ever do. Commissioner Brown, I think you were first. Go ahead.
Great. Mr. Chair, actually, I have many questions of not only of this august buddy sitting down here, but of just in general. And I just wonder, considering the hour, do you want to come back after lunch, or how would you like to proceed?
It's a good question. It is an appropriate time for a break. My concern is the professionals that have given their time. Are you comfortable taking a break and coming back, or is it?
Okay.
I personally have an important appointment at 1 o'clock that I need to get back to my office for.
I would very much appreciate it if we could move ahead with the questions.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I actually liked your suggestion personally, that there are so many changes to this document that have been proposed that I think the idea of a continuance is an appropriate one. If we can finish this in a reasonable time manner, I would be happy to stay through lunch to do so. But if we can't, then I'm wondering if we're just trying to rush through something in order to accommodate, and I don't feel comfortable with that either.
Well, let me suggest something. In order to take advantage of everybody being here, Commissioner Brown, perhaps you and other commissioners that have them can tailor questions for this group, and we could finish up in 15 minutes. And then with the idea that at that time, we would continue the hearing to a future date for purposes of reviewing any suggested changes and what our action, if any, should be.
Okay.
Is that okay with you?
That's great.
Is everybody okay waiting 15 more minutes before our lunch break? We do have one other item we'll have to come back for in any event.
Okay.
So go ahead
Okay,
with your question.
all right, thank you. You know, I appreciate what you're trying to do, and I think it's important. You know, as I look at my own community in Goleta, our urban area is basically south of Cathedral Oaks to the shore, the seashore, and it's Hope Ranch. And I guess anecdotally, this might pertain to Hope Ranch, but you know what? In the Goleta Valley neighborhoods, this doesn't sort of really make much sense. I don't think that it may make sense, but I'm just concerned about some of these guidelines that are being proposed here are sort of above and beyond. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, is it the people in Goleta that you've worked with that are dealing with the oak issues, or is it really Montecito and Hope Ranch? That's the first question.
In my case, it's mostly Montecito, a little bit of Hope Ranch, and I have had experiences in the Lompoc area.
Okay, so really nothing in the Goleta urban area per se. Right, okay. I would just like to start on your page. This is for Mr. Easton, where you spoke about I guess this is page 2, or this sheet. On the information below the tree diagram, where we've talked about pruning and tree leaning, I thought in our last conversation back in July that one of the issues was about these leaning trees and some concerns that arborists had regarding the critical root zone for those trees. And yet here I see that you want to sort of eliminate that. Would you respond to that, please?
May I respond?
Yeah, okay.
To?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I wish I had said something earlier. I think all of us wish that we'd come in, because we thought we had come in pretty united on this. But I thought if the opportunity presented it to lose that, it would be appropriate, because I think Pat, who drafted these guidelines with the group, her intention was to keep them very simple and not to get into the specifics. The specifics, however, will be addressed, but they'll be addressed not in a global way, which is what results in the unintended consequences, is when you try to anticipate what could happen. The way in which we're anticipating what might happen is the point at which the professional arborist would come onto the site and then would evaluate the particular situation, which, the variables of which, could not be contained in any document, and make his or her recommendations specifically relative to what's proposed on the site, the environmental situation on the site, and the particular trees found on the site. And I don't think you can really get into particulars effectively without unintended consequences otherwise. And that was my concern. When I did first read this, I thought, well, I could live with that. But I think this would be a stronger document without it, because it's so particular. And it's anticipating things in an almost anecdotal way, like, maybe somebody would cut back some limbs so they wouldn't have to worry about the drip line. I think the chances of that are small. And it also sets up this other thing that Community Planning Renaissance is interested in, is that we see ourselves as being the same as you. You're the planning commission, you're the decision maker. These are the planners that do the work, but we are the professionals who care as much as you do and want the same outcome. And so we got together as CPR so we could start to look at this effort as a team again and not look at it in an oppositional kind of a way. And this was my reason. I was once on that side of the table. And the reason I became a landscape architect is so I could come in and propose projects that are acceptable and are environmentally sensitive. And I think that the other problem with this little line in here is it smacks of a distrust and a feeling that it's only I, as a staff person or a planning commissioner, truly have environmental values. I think it smacks of that, and I don't think that attitude should be represented in this brochure at all.
I agree, and Commissioner Brown, certainly my goal with this, and what I think we really have to do to get the confidence of the community is be as concrete as possible in this document. If there's a leaning tree, that's the job of the arborist or the person doing the review to identify and come up with recommendations.
Well, this brings me back to my other question. The sentence in here, these guidelines apply to properties with oaks where a permit is required for a proposed project. So the homeowner in Goleta with this remodel who's got this oak will have to go through this, and we don't that doesn't occur now, so this would be an extra step for them.
Well, yes and no. Many times, if right now, arborist reports are required at planning department. If you go in for a regular remodel, and if somebody wants to build under the drip line of that tree, they're going to be asked to provide have an arborist report now.
Commissioner Brown, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, I think the issue in Goleta will only arise if there's a tree that might be impacted. If there isn't a tree, this doesn't come up.
Right, but how would know? See, my question is that these guidelines, and the homeowner goes, oh, I've got this oak in my backyard, and I didn't realize I had to do all this, or this is now I'm going to have to jump through these hoops. And
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, it's really, if it's a change, it's to lessen the concern about that, because I can guarantee you if you have a constituent in Goleta that has an oak in their backyard, and if they wanted to come in and develop anywhere near that tree, they'd probably have more concerns right now than they would if this brochure were published.
Okay.
Because those policies exist and they would be applied.
Okay. Ms. Perez made a comment about this little brochure replacing the tree protection policy, which I presume you meant the 2002 guidelines. Is that?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Brown, that's correct. It's not actually a policy, although it's interesting. It's
Is it-
titled a tree protection policy paper.
right.
But this was a document prepared by P&D
Right,
staff
right,
in
right.
2002 to try to clarify
I understand.
what protect to the maximum extent feasible means in your community plan policies.
My question concerning that, though, is that there are many policies that are very specific, for instance, about the replacement of the valley oaks and the blue oaks, or I guess blue oaks are 15-to-1 ratio. And here, it's just a broad statement about the replacement ratio of up to 10 oaks. So that is more specific and more protective in certain areas, and this is less. I mean, one could read it that way. So I'm just concerned that we're going to a document that's very broad, very general. Maybe you'd like to...
Let me just interject in the interest of time because we're running out of it. Those are questions we should take up with staff
Okay, that's
as
fine.
to the whole purpose. You have questions that bear on specific changes they'd like to make or something like that. Let's go to those.
Well, I have some others. On the tree report contents, I think it would be important to add a section that talks about the tree replacement location that provides conditions to ensure that areas proposed for replacement should be suitable to foster growth. I mean, I can't imagine an arborist coming and making a recommendation that it would be in an area that wouldn't, but I just wonder if that might not be an important thing to have. Also in the Goleta Valley, I know that in a lot of tree restoration, and even in local trees, that they're using local genetic stock. And I'm sort of distressed that this is being lessened to put where feasible, because I think that this is occurring in the Goleta Valley, and yet we seem to think it's a little less important than where feasible. Because I think to some community members that is an important issue. And I guess some of the other concerns I have about the size of the box trees in terms of replacement and some of these other things that I guess we can address with staff that are a little more general. So.
Yeah, I think you folks made a great presentation for why we should consider these changes, and my concern is sort of fundamental. I'm not necessarily for or against. I just want to understand where they go and what they're going to do to the whole document, and it's going to take us a little more time to do that, assuming we have any role in this process at all, which is being questioned by one of our legally trained commissioners. So we need to address that issue as well. But I think it's very beneficial to have had your input this morning, and to the extent you can continue to participate with us along the way as we decide what to do and what to say, it will be helpful to us. Not necessarily that all of you need to come, but we'd love to have your continued oversight of what we do. Mr. Easton.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Cooney. We really want to expedite this as fast as we can. We want to save oak trees. It's dragged on long enough, as we've all said. So if the staff could make the kind of changes that we propose to make and bring it back at your next meeting, that would be ideal.
We have a meeting with a little room on the 7th here in Santa Barbara, if that's a time that works for you people, or at least some of you.
Certainly I can make it.
Well, I think it would be helpful for all of us while it's fresh in our mind to return to the subject rather than waiting till March or something when we have to crank it up again. So I'd certainly entertain that kind of motion. Before we do take that action, is there anything else we need to know today?
Well, Mr. Chair, I certainly have several questions and comments on this thing, and I'm not ready to say that we're at a continuance on this thing.
Let's assume that we come back at 1:15. We take this matter up again and continue the discussion, get all the commissioners' concerns at least addressed, and then see whether a continuance is appropriate. It's very difficult for me to imagine that we would take action today And to the extent that you've made a request that we consider an early continuance, we're certainly going to take that into account. Okay, so we'll take our lunch break of an hour. Is that good enough for everybody, 1:15? Okay, we'll be back at 1:15 then. Thank you. And thanks again for coming.
And the reason why I'm going to couch that comment is this, is that I think I'm getting the feeling from prior discussions before we broke that we may want to continue this item. And for that reason, I'll be looking for a motion to that effect. But in order to help staff in bringing us this information back again, questions that would guide them and assist them, or comments that would guide them and assist them, might be helpful. So I'm going to start with Commissioner Brown.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I want to speak for a moment about the item number 5 on the guidelines, where it talks about replacement, because it does talk about the ratio of up to 10 oaks as an appropriate size per lost tree. And I believe in the 2002 guidelines they speak about the ratio of 10 to 1. Now, I understand that in the urban areas, and I guess you see my thinking of an urban area is my 10,000 square foot lot in a Goleta neighborhood. And your perspective of this is not this 10,000 square foot lot in Montecito, but probably a 1 acre lot, I would guess, or in Montecito. So it's different, but if these guidelines, as you propose to replace the 2002 guidelines, I think that there is some difference between an up to or just a rather a 10 to 1, and of course it doesn't address the issue about the other kinds of oak trees. Now, to follow along down in that paragraph, there's one crucial thing here that's missing for me. You speak in the urban areas where replanting area is limited, the use of a 24-inch box tree may be accepted at a 3:1 ratio. In the guidelines, it talks about the sentence that precedes this says 1 gallon nursery stock goes more vigorously and adapts better to site conditions than larger stock. And Ms. Van Atta, you're a landscape architect, and you probably can attest that planting an oak tree from that, you get probably more vigorous growth because the roots aren't constrained in some other issues. But somehow we've sort of lost sight of just putting in the smaller size oaks and seeing them be more vigorous growers probably than the 24-inch box. And again, I think that this is more for a larger type of estate than these smaller properties. I would guess this is where you use these 24-inch box trees, right? Is that not?
Could you restate the question to make sure I understand what you're
Well, the
asking?
question is, in the O2 guidelines, it talks about the 1 gallon nursery stock growing more vigorously and adapting better to site conditions than the 24-inch box. And I just find it difficult to think that because we're speaking urban, and I have to think outside of Hope Ranch and Montecito, that a homeowner in the South Coast urban area outside of Montecito would consider a 24-inch box tree when a 1 gallon nursery stock would be totally appropriate.
I think the intention is that I think the origin of 10 to 1 replacement was a habitat restoration issue. I think it came out of things like pipeline mitigation to where you're in the middle of nowhere and you plant 10 1-gallon oaks hoping that one of them will survive. And so the 10 to 1 replacement doesn't necessarily apply that well in an urban area, but especially I think in the areas you're talking about where somebody has a 10,000 square foot lot, it would be very difficult to accommodate 10 1-gallon trees under those circumstances. And so this would, in first take care of a limited space situation. And the reality is, I think, in an urban environment, that when trees are planted larger, that they are a tree when they go in the ground. A 1 gallon oak tree is not really identifiable by most people who aren't paying attention as even being a tree. So I think the idea is that if you were that a 24-inch box tree is the smallest size of trees sold in California that would be clearly recognized as a tree.
Well, I guess I have problems making a recommendation to what I think to whom these guidelines would apply, that this might be a 24-inch box tree might be acceptable. You couldn't even get this, a 24-inch box tree into someone's backyard, as I know a backyard.
Okay, well, I mean, that's also the largest size that you can hand truck around.
Well, I'd have to take down a fence if I were to put this in my backyard, is all I'm going to say.
Yeah, it's 2 feet wide.
Right.
It's 2 feet wide.
But I would have...
But
so anyway, I just...
you know what I think that, I'm really sorry, if I may, to kind of go back to the more global intent. The intent really is that what has been drafted outlines something very general, and then once one was to get into the specifics, as you are talking about right now, one would refer to the specifics of, let's say, the specific plan for an individual region for those kinds of guidelines, like 10-to-1, whatever the ratio is, or if it addresses a different type of tree. This does not supersede that. These are just guidelines. So keeping it simple, I think even the point that you're making is, wow, what about this, what about the other thing, reinforces the point I think that we're trying to make, is that if we keep these guidelines really simple, then people won't be running into these debates, and then they can go to the individual planning area and look for specific guidance. And then also, I think it's important to still depend upon the only way that you can deal with individual circumstances is individually. You can't anticipate all the problems, so then the arborist and the planner will get involved and use judgment as to what would be most appropriate in the individual situations. And I think that the problem with the more detailed guidelines that were laid out before is it went into too much depth on anticipating potential problems and what you do if you run into a certain problem. All problems can't be anticipated, therefore you run into these unanticipated consequences. So I think simplicity is the beauty of what's been put before you now.
I'm going to just break in here again just to, if we could keep the comments to really be directing to staff in terms of whatever they're going to come back with. And this is helpful discussion, but I think we're going to end up doing this again. And I'm sure that we're going to have an opportunity to discuss all these issues again if staff misses a point and doesn't bring back something that we're happy with. So I'm just asking for expediency if we can.
I understand that, and I appreciate that. And I guess my concern is I just think that I understand why they're trying to do this. I just feel that some of their approaches aren't necessarily broad enough for my understanding of what the urban area is to me. I'm not familiar with Montecito. I know something about Hope Ranch, and there may be policies in here which are more pertinent to them than what one might consider for the urban guidelines. That's my
So I'm going to ask do you understand, staff, that Commissioner Brown is concerned about definitions for the urban boundary and that be clear, particularly taking into account the Goleta issue?
Mr. Chair, I understand. I'm not quite sure how I can incorporate that concern into this very brief brochure. Yeah, and I don't want to overstep the question that you asked, but I guess my concern is that there seems to be some desire that the brochure answer every question, and that's really not the intent of it. It's really to set a framework in a fairly positive way of the general rule, and establish when an arborist report is required, and then leave a lot of discretion within the context of the policies that apply in a particular urban area to an arborist to come up with solutions. So that's why language about replacement is quite general and says up to 10-to-1. You know, there's other options available if you can't do small trees, but it would really be at the arborist's recommendation, and everything we're talking about after avoidance requires an arborist to be involved. So that's where I'm sort of trying to understand how much detail we want to go into and what sorts of exceptions we want to outline in a brochure that's meant to be fairly general. So
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may, you see, Ms. Black, for me, when I read the O2 guidelines, I appreciate, because I garden a lot, I'm into horticulture, I'm into all these other issues. This kind of detail for me is important to know the specifics. When I look at this document, I feel that there are some specifics that are removed, which are sort of protective of oak trees in people's backyard. We sort of removed some of the science in terms of going from critical root zone to drip line plus 5 feet, what that means for big, huge, oaks that are 100 years old and how that would affect them. Well, all that sort of science has all been sort of lost to some expediency in order to provide guidelines which are meant to be more protective and more informative and simpler. I guess I'm just caught in this in that I don't see that. I'm caught in these guidelines, which I think for me are very valuable because it provides a lot more detailed information, and this document doesn't. And maybe it's because, I don't say I know too much, but maybe because if I were just a homeowner with some oaks and I didn't know everything in the O2 guidelines, then maybe this would be the document for me. Maybe that's part of the problem.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, I think maybe it is, and I think it might have been part of the problem with staff drafting that original O2 document. It became so long and answered so many if, what's, then this and that, and all of these different situations that it was scary to the average homeowner. And what we're trying to do is to produce something that an average homeowner can understand, and that the professionals in the community and the planners that work with these homeowners can give to them and say, here's when you have to do a tree report, and here are some general parameters that your professional is going to look at. But we're not trying to make them experts on replacement ratios and whether or not local stock is available and how to measure a tree if it leans and how to properly prune a tree. We're not trying to make that level of detail. We're just really trying to give them here's what it means if you have a tree on your property. Here's when, it's not going to mean anything to you if you completely avoid this particular area. And if you don't, then you're going to have a tree report done, and it's going to look at these various things. And so that was the intent. And we may have mixed and some level of detail in there that doesn't work, and we're willing to take a look at that. But the intent is for it to be pretty general and just give an indication of when a report's required and when one isn't required and what they'll generally look at. You know too much.
And I do want to remind, we will have an opportunity to come back and ask and deal with whatever staff returns. So, Commissioner Boyson.
Thank you very much. Ms. Seeley, and I was hoping that some of these questions would be answered in the course of the presentation. That's why I didn't ask them before we got it. What were the specific EDC comments that were incorporated into our...
Can you give me a minute? I'd have to go. Mr. Chairman, in response, I do have those emails. There were some questions actually about replacement, and there were maybe 2 or 3 between Brian Troutwine of EDC and Darlene Sherman, and we addressed those, gave them the wording back, and they were fine with that. But I'd have to look at the specifics. I don't recall.
But it wasn't anything
Nothing
major. All right.
significant.
What in your presentation, you mentioned this was a South County item. I don't see anywhere in here that this is directed at the South County. It appears to me that this is a county-wide brochure.
Mr. Chairman, in response to Commissioner Boyson, yes, that's correct. Countywide in the urban areas, and the fact of the matter is the greater majority of urban areas are, as you like to say, below the Gaviota Tunnel.
I don't even see where it says urban area in here.
Urban
I
oak
see
tree.
that it says urban oak tree but I don't see that it specifically says that these, what I see that this says is that these guidelines apply to properties where, with oaks where permit is required.
We can add it.
I mean, that would, I mean, that could be, I mean, if I'm building a house on 40 acres, I need a permit.
we can
But
make that
anyways,
clear.
those are some of the things. You know, and I appreciate the fact Ms. Perez and Ms. Saley and Ms. Black tried to do an intervention on me between our last meeting and this meeting. And you know, it almost worked. But I'm kind of like Commissioner Brown. I think this is very dangerous to give just a little bit of information. And I think these are just things that these leave all kinds of interpretations up to staff. And I think that's where we got in the problem that we have right now, that we're going to have staff deciding what policy is going to be on oak trees. And I could not, I realize I'm not going to be here when this comes back. Under no circumstances could I support going forward with a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors on something like this, that we establish these sort of guidelines, unless it specifically says. I think that's what community plans are all about. I don't know why we're even doing this. It's like Mr. Field was saying, if we go with this global approach, does that trump the community plans or vice versa? And slippery slopes. Sorry.
Any other commissioner have a question for staff or CPR? Seeing none, I'm going to entertain a motion then for continuance.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to continue this to the meeting of the 7th of February with incorporating Commission's comments and concerns, or unless, Ms. Black, you have other... Well, because I think that we've said some things that perhaps will help direct staff. It may be too global, maybe for you to respond.
How about if we
be
just
responsive.
leave this as
As open-ended.
an open-ended
Great.
continuance,
Okay.
and if staff doesn't return with something that we can support, well,
Okay,
that
fine.
will be determined.
Okay. Mr. Chair, my only comment is, I don't know if I can return with something you can support, because I don't get a sense that the goal that we're trying to achieve is supported by the commission. So we'll try one more time and see what we come up with.
Thank you. So I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
For discussion, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to vote no to the continuance, just because, as Ms. Black is saying, I don't see anything coming. I don't need a continuance to know where I'm going on this.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a comment.
Go
All
ahead,
this
Commissioner.
came out because of Venter Kendall Jackson, who bulldozed all those trees. No? Okay, so what?
Mr.
what
Chair, that's
brought-
that
what-
whole rural oak ordinance.
So-
This came out of the original process improvement recommendations that came from the community, and specifically from the process improvement venture and from Community Planning Renaissance. And they asked us to help clarify 5 issues. One was oak protection policies. Second was building height, and we actually modified the definition of building height. The third was the big house issue, which we ran away
so
from.
this is where that came from.
Stream setbacks, and I can't remember and grading, which we did some work on. So
Okay.
that's where it originally came from.
And where did they find the major problem to be, in the South Coast or in the entire county, or what?
Well, I think what you heard from Ms. Vanetta, and she's the only one that addressed this, is it's mainly Montecito, a little bit of Hope Ranch, and she's had this issue come up a bit in Vandenberg, Lompoc. But it's where the oaks are most prevalent in urban areas.
In the North County, there's been one issue in Vandenberg Village on a tree that was growing on one neighbor's house, and the arm was went to the next neighbor's house. The neighbor wanted to put an extension on there, if you recall, wanted to add a room, and he wanted to take that arm down, and so it came before us, and we dealt with that. Is that the only case that, I
Mis-
can't think of another case ever that came before us in all the years
Mr.
I've
Chair
been
and,
here.
and Commissioner Valencia, I'm not suggesting all these cases even have come before you. I'm just reiterating what Ms. Van Etta said about where she's seen these issues arise, not necessarily to the level of the Planning Commission.
Well, putting into some kind of perspective of the issues, in California, there's over 1 million acres of these oaks. In Santa Barbara County, there's 13,000 acres of live oak and 4,800 acres of the other type of oak. And I suspect most of these are in the North County, and I just find it hard to believe that we really need these guidelines for these things that have been taking care of themselves, and the people have been good stewards of the land. They just, it's just
Well,
an added,
Not, Mr. Chair, not to belabor the point, but we already have pages and pages and pages of policy, and what we were talking about is just trying to help
Upgrade it.
people understand.
Ms. Black,
what
I
this
think
might
we
mean.
are belaboring the issue. So let us take this to a vote. I think if we're going to vote on a continuance, if we don't want to continue, then vote no. But if you want to continue this matter, then support the motion.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Boyson?
No.
Commissioner Valencia?
aye.
Commissioner Smyser?
Aye.
Vote carries 3-1.
All right, so this issue will be heard again on February the 7th. I think the staff has heard from all the commissioners at this point on this issue. Let's move right on to item number 3, workshop on proposed revisions of the county coastal development permit process. I'm going to give staff 2 minutes to set up, literally 2 minutes.
A way to make some sense out of our coastal development permit process. Okay, so, I'm sorry, I haven't quite gotten my head into this next one. We currently have a discretionary process in the coastal zone, includes conditional use permits, development plans, tract maps, all those sorts of various permits that you see. And then we have a follow-up permit process, the CDP process. The way that our CDP process is outlined, it's also a permit that's appealable all the way to the Coastal Commission in the appeals jurisdiction. So we have a situation where somebody goes through a discretionary process, and I'm just going to use the development plan as a surrogate for all the discretionary permits. They go through the development plan process. They come to your commission. They're potentially appealable to the Board of Supervisors and then potentially appealable to the Coastal Commission. They go back after they get through the permit process and receive approval, work on their conditions of approval, come in for clearance of those conditions, and we issue them a coastal development permit. And the way that coastal development permit works in our ordinance and in the Coastal Commission regulations is that's a fully appealable permit as well. Same thing as land use permits, but just add a step, add the Coastal Commission process. So what we're looking to do today is to try and remedy that so that we aren't putting people in this double jeopardy process when we don't feel it's warranted, when the commission and the county doesn't feel it's warranted. And this is something that the Coastal Commission staff has been requesting that we do for some time because it's very confusing to them. Other jurisdictions don't have this sort of double appeal process. This just illustrates what our existing process could potentially be in terms of a specific development application. So an applicant would come in, they would file a discretionary application, we'd conduct environmental review, we'd conduct a notice public hearing with the Planning Commission, have an appeal could be filed, have a notice hearing before the Board of Supervisors, another appeal could be filed, have a notice public hearing before the Coastal Commission. And then follow-up permit, so they've got their action. The follow-up permit requires an application, a public notice. There's the potential for appeal. If it's appealed, it comes to the Planning Commission. If the Planning Commission's decision is appealed, it goes to the Board of Supervisors. If that decision's appealed, it goes to the Coastal Commission. Same project, 2 sets of appeals to essentially 3 decision-making bodies. And we actually saw this in a couple of cases recently. I think you're probably pretty aware of those. Best example, Coral Casino, where both the discretionary action and the coastal development permit were appealed. Same exact issue, no new issues were raised between those two appeals. And the original decision was upheld. So the goal that we had in bringing this item forward for discussion is to really just have one appeal on a discretionary action. So have your commission and the board and the Coastal Commission make a decision once, and then assuming that nothing of substance changes, the follow-up permit would not be appealable. And so what we're suggesting is that we do the same thing that we suggested for CEUPs and DPs in the inland area, is to have the follow-up action be a zoning clearance rather than a coastal development permit. And then again, if we do a substantial conformity determination, that follow-up permit, we may want to just have be a land use permit where we're the final decision-making body. And when I say we, I mean the County of Santa Barbara and not the Coastal Commission. So instead of having that potentially 15-step process, we're looking at an 8-step process, which, while it may not be ideal in some people's eyes, is certainly better than 15. So just quick summary of the kind of some of the data. We've had one CDP appeal following a discretionary permit since 2000. That was the Coral Casino project. It also required an SCD, a substantial conformity determination. So under this new process, at least a land use permit would have been issued. We have looked at, as we try to do on all of our process improvements, what other jurisdictions do, particularly the jurisdictions in the County of Santa Barbara and in the adjoining counties. And we couldn't find anybody who had their follow-up clearance set up the way ours is, with a discretionary or a potentially appealable permit as the action. We've also had some preliminary discussions over probably the last 20 years, but most recently the last week or so, with the Coastal Commission staff, and they strongly support us cleaning up our process. So we're just looking for some direction, and assuming your commission thinks this is a step in the right direction, then we will probably bring back ordinance language to your commission for both the land use permit inland area as well as the CDP coastal area at the same time for your consideration of the Montecito Planning Commission. Was that quick enough?
That was very good. I'm going to open it up for public comment. I don't see any members of the public and have not received any speaker slips, so we'll then return it to the commission for commission questions to staff. Excuse me. Yes, Commissioner Brown.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Black, my only concern here is that that we may be, it's about the public process. I want to make sure that I fully understand the noticing that goes on with this reduced procedure. So I think it's on that page, right? So an application is filed. Would they all have environmental review? You're using as not necessarily.
Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown, all discretionary applications are subject to CEQA, so they at least are reviewed and a determination of exemption is made, if not a negative declaration or EIR prepared. But in any event, your hearing is noticed both by mail and.
But also, if there were environmental review,
that would be noticed as
well. And how is that noticed to the public?
If an environmental document is prepared in ND or in EIR, then we do the same notice we do for your hearings, essentially. We do mailed notice of the availability of the document, and we put it in the newspaper.
Yes, but to whom? I mean, is it this with 300-foot radius, or depending upon?
At least 300 feet.
Okay, and it's also posted? No.
We
Maybe.
don't post the site for discretionary
Okay,
permits.
so it would be mailed notice to those within 300 feet, or for a larger project,
1,000,
1,000.
or a display ad in the newspaper.
Okay, so it would be the environmental review if that occurs, and then also the PC hearing.
And any appeal hearing, right.
Right, okay, thank you.
Any other commissioners wish to ask questions at this time? Yes, Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize for missing the first part of the hearing, and if you answered this, by all means, just tell me that, and I'll catch up. But my concern is a situation where there's a substantial gap between the discretionary approval and the follow-up permit. And the example I'm thinking of, this was also discussed by us as a commission in the context of the large subdivision building permits, and I recall expressing at that time the same concern that sometimes you'll have, let's say, a subdivision of 4 or fewer lots, and there's one house that's on the property at the time that ends up being the only residence on the 4 lots. Years later, the subsequent owner of one of the subdivided lots comes in and says, I would like to build a house on this property. What's the level of review of that particular residence at that time?
Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Cooney.
That situation's a little bit different than what we're talking about here. 'Cause
Okay.
what you're talking about is when the only discretionary review was the map, and the follow-up permit is zoning clearance. That's what we reviewed, and we set a cutoff date of a not to begin date of 1990. On these permits, it's a little bit different because you're not creating a lot through a development plan or a conditional use permit or some other entitlement. You're giving discretionary approval and a time limit in which to get your clearance. So CUP's typical timeline to get clearance and begin construction of your project is 18 months. Sometimes the commission gives longer periods of time. Sometimes you grant extensions. Development plans are typically 5 years, with the potential for extensions, but I would say that's an exception, not the rule. Most people get permits within a year or two on these sorts of projects. So I think it's a little different situation than when you create a lot. And we addressed that by having that cutoff date. We contemplated that here, but then we realized, well, if we use 1990, there wouldn't be any. We wouldn't really be capturing anything, excluding anything.
Commissioner Cooney, any follow-up questions?
No.
Any questions from any other members of the commission?
The only thing, I'm scared to ask a question for fear that we might expand this whole process. No, I'm fully supportive of this process. I think that it's worked very well up in North Canada. I realize it's not on the coast, but I think that zoning clearance idea has worked very well on improved subdivisions and this sort of thing, and especially when we do have something that's going to happen in a fairly short order period of time. So I would certainly encourage this as a process of allowing people to achieve their property rights that have been given once and twice and 3 times, and not have them come back 6 times as we are now. So.
I'm not sure if we need a motion to accept the report. I don't believe we do. In that case, I want to thank my fellow commissioners. The chair is back. Would you like to close the meeting, Mr. Chair?
Mr. Chair, can I just
Yes.
raise one issue, and that is that I know this gentleman, and I don't know his name, was here earlier, and Tony Fisher, and had asked me when this item might come up. So I don't know if he wanted to provide some input to the commission, if you want to accept it, but no? Okay.
Thank you very much for coming.
Sorry,
And if you have any questions, staff will hang around for a little bit and answer those questions for you.
Thanks.
I guess at this time, then, the commission meeting is adjourned. I'll take a motion for adjournment. Do we need it? No, then it's adjourned.